we'll go down in order that way. Well, I guess, no, we're going to jump around, so it doesn't really matter.
No, it makes sense.
Okay. Well, that is an issue at times, but actually, it's being addressed already.
That was a...
Not on the opening panel. So it's a separate. Sorry, no, we didn't mean to. That
You
makes it
bet.
even worse.
That was a good leap.
I was going to say it helps the gender balance actually.
I'm not sure you're supposed to say that quite that openly.
I'm sorry.
No, I'm retired. I'm fine.
Yeah. Okay. It's all right. Yeah, I'll use it. I assume it's on. So. Good afternoon, and welcome to everyone. My name is Thomas Spearstaker. I'm in the faculty here at the Graduate Institute, where I'm the Director of Policy Research and also the Director of the Program for the Study of International Governance. It's my great pleasure to welcome you to this event on the UN's normative role in an Agenda 2030 world. I'll have a few opening remarks in a moment, but first I'd like to introduce and turn the microphone over to our colleague in organizing and co-organizing this event, Henrik Hammarskjöld from the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. He's the executive director of the foundation, and in fact, you will see there are speaker biographies in your program, so we're not going to take valuable time introducing the speakers. You can read about us as we proceed. But Henrik, thank you very much for joining us and encouraging us to organize this event. It's a great pleasure to work with you on this.
Thank you very much, Thomas, and it's indeed our pleasure to be here. And warm welcome to you all also that has come to this conference. We're, of course, very proud not only to be able to organize this together with the Geneva Institute, but also to be here and see such a good turnout. We're really glad over that, but we're not surprised. I think this is a good reflection of sort of how Geneva in many ways are sort of the normative hub of multilateralism, if you like. Well, the issues we're here to discuss today is really at the very core of the future of multilateralism and the role of the UN. And let me just start by recognizing the complexity of the conceptual understanding of norm and the fact that today's discussion will only aim to reach out and define parts of this complexity. I would also like to underline the fact that we are recognizing human rights to be at the very, very core of the global normative framework, of course. We will discuss different types of norms, from standards to international law, realizing that some are older and some are new, and we will also identify many different types of frameworks. There are many new protocols and goals, etc., which most actually includes a normative part. We will also talk about different levels, global, regional, sub-regional, and even national levels. And the discussion will take the 2030 agenda as a starting point. The agenda has a clear normative underpinning, and it rests on norms and standards across the fields of social, economical, and environmental sustainability. And ultimately, it seeks to realize the fundamental normative principles of all the UN, namely human rights for all. Well, the reason we took this initiative to the conference and developed this with the Geneva Institute is that we see this, there's an increased focus on UN's normative role over the past few years. And at the same time, we see a lack of clarity in terms of what this is, whose responsibility, what are the instruments to actually implement this and to monitor them, and by whom, etc. And so we hope, by way of this conference, to start such a discussion, to be able to contribute to a renewed discussion with the aim to generate some specific ideas for how to strengthen the UN's normative function. Where are the gaps? How can these be addressed? And what are some of the opportunities ahead? I think we also need to realize that perhaps the whole normative and the future of multilateralism is even more challenged today than perhaps ever before, challenged by nationalism, protectionism, and also populism. So we're again very happy to see so many of you here, and we hope this is going to be a very interesting and fruitful discussion. We see this as a starting point, and we hope that it's not only sort of a one-off seminar, but rather a first in a structured work to really strengthen this whole approach. So Thomas, again, thanks so much for co-hosting this with us and inviting us. So thank you.
Thank you, Henry. Let me say a few words about the Graduate Institute and the program on governance, and then say something about international norms and why we think the discussion of norms and normative agendas is so important. First, just with regard to the Graduate Institute, I would say we are committed to policy engagement, and we take seriously the social role and public responsibility of the scholarly community. And as Director of Policy Research, I can attest to the extent to which our many centers and programs are actively engaged in policy-relevant research on trade, finance, development, peace building, health, gender, migration, and governance, and the environment. But beyond the centers, I would argue that the majority of our faculty, and I think our students as well, share a sense of social responsibility. That is, a sense that it is our responsibility to draw on our knowledge, to draw on our accumulated intellectual capital, and to draw on our resources of time and independent perspective to inform contemporary global challenges. In fact, I suppose you could say that it's one of our normative roles as an institution, is to play this kind of involvement. Now, the program for the study of governance in particular, which I direct, is engaged in an ongoing effort to try to bring the latest results in research to bear on the comparative analysis of different governance arrangements operating in different domains, issue domains, involving both public and private actors. And earlier this year, some of you, I think, were involved in this. In fact, I know you were involved. Earlier this year, we co-organized a major conference with the UN University. We organized a conference here in Geneva in April that brought scholars from universities and think tanks from around the world to explore with UN colleagues how the UN can better draw upon the research that is undertaken outside the UN system and to improve its performance, both research on the UN, but also research on key priorities of the UN and the UN system, more generally speaking. So the program also serves, and I should say this, the program also serves as the Graduate Institute's hub for identifying research underway throughout the Institute by faculty, students and research centers that can contribute to the achievement of the SDGs by 2030, hence another reason for us to be very pleased to co-sponsor this event. The broad subject of today's discussion, norms and normative role of institutions, I think could not be more timely and important. And I echo Henry's comment about concerns about the future directions of multilateralism in the world today for a large variety of reasons. And I would argue that norms are intrinsic to the operation of international organizations like the UN. Indeed, the articulation of international norms is one of the primary indications of the ability of the organization to act as an independent actor on the world stage. And I say that because the UN is more than just the sum of its member states and their interactions at UN meetings, as important as those are. But norms are also intrinsic to the UN's role as an independent actor, as an agent operating on behalf of the peoples of the nations that comprise the world, not just the states. So what are norms? I mean, well, we're going to hear a lot about norms. Let me just suggest that norms are standards of appropriate behavior for actors with a given identity, typically an identity as part of a larger community. And norms can be, and sometimes are, broken or ignored by key actors. So norms are general tendencies that guide behavior and provide guidance when confronting contradictory goals or difficult trade-offs. There are different types of norms as well. The scholarly literature commonly differentiates between behavioral and prescriptive norms. That is, behavioral norms are routine behaviors, things that actors do without thinking. They're not laws, because some actors ignore them, but they're norms to the extent that they are broadly recognized, performed, and internalized by major actors. They have a certain taken for granted quality. They're considered natural. They're largely unquestioned. And professions codify and inculcate them in their training and certification, just as we do here at the Graduate Institute. And institutions embody them in their rules structures, and operating procedures. And sometimes norms are even legalized. Prescriptive norms provide guidance, so differentiating prescriptive from behavioral. Prescriptive norms provide guidance about not just what is routinely done, but what should be done. Hence, they serve as a guide for what to do when confronting contradictory goals or difficult trade-offs. And many of the most powerful contemporary norms can be found in the realm of human rights, but they also extend to behavior in war and conflict, in development, and in protection of the environment. One aspect of norms that I think is so important is that they have to be performed. They constantly performed and practiced. That is, they have to be articulated, they have to be reiterated, they have to be asserted, because if not, norms will degrade. Some of the early scholarly research on norms tended to argue, basically viewed them as endpoints to be internalized in the behavior of state actors. But today we know that norms can be contested, can decay, and can even be replaced. And that's why I think it's so important to talk about norms and the UN's role in articulating, defending, and maintaining them, and also providing a basis or a location for the creation and shaping and modification of norms. So adding a normative component to our discussion and analysis of Agenda 2030 is also important for another reason. We constantly talk about governance, but rarely do we step back and examine explicitly what's the normative quality of governance. And in fact, different governance arrangements, something I've tried to do in some of my recent publications on the meaning of global governance. We tend to proceed from an assumption that governance is good. And I think it is. I mean, some kind of purposive, rule-governed order is certainly to be preferred to anarchy and chaos. But there are a great many different types of order, and we need to evaluate the normative quality of different orders, both in process terms, that is, how inclusive, how representative, how transparent, how accountable are governance arrangements, but also in terms of outcome and performance, how effective and how efficient are the existing norms. So this afternoon we have an opportunity to listen, to learn, and to engage, because part of normative formation is engagement in a conversation with both policy practitioners and scholars who are deeply engaged in discussions about Agenda 2030, with a particular focus on the UN's normative role in the process. So I'm looking very much forward to the conversations and discussions we'll have throughout the afternoon. And with that, let me turn things over to Bruce Jenks, who serves as an advisor to the Hammarskjöld Foundation and has also been deeply involved in the thinking and organization of this event. Bruce.
What's the trick? Oh, it's on. That's a good trick. Yeah. Good afternoon. Great to be here. Somehow they didn't want me to say the good afternoon, nice to be here bit. The starting point, I think, for this discussion is the extraordinary profile that has been given to the importance of strengthening norms in the UN system today. There's absolutely nothing new, obviously, about the normative agenda in the UN. It was there at the birth of all the specialized agencies, the charter, and everything else. But the attention, the focus on the need for the strengthening of norms and the particular role of the UN in the normative agenda is something that has attracted unusual amount of focus recently. We certainly see it in the Agenda 2030. If you look at the discussion that's been going on for 2 or 3 years on UN reform, QCPR, all the stuff on the UN development system, one of the few areas of clear consensus is the pivotal role of norms in the work of the UN. So this is not a contested proposition, I don't believe, although everything in the UN is ultimately contested. So that takes me to really 3 points that I'd like to make. Excuse me, I have a horrible cough, so I want a couple of extra minutes to take care of the coughing part of my presentation. Why now? Why is it historically now that this attention has suddenly come? Very briefly, because I think this is kind of old territory, a couple of converging factors. One is clearly the changing distribution of economic power, the emergence of new economic powers. Whenever you have a situation of emerging powers and status quo powers, there's likely to be a big focus on the rules of the game, how are they going to change, Are the newcomers going to be adapted, are going to be included, or are they going to be excluded? That kind of a discussion. So it's normal in those circumstances. But not only do we see a situation of these emerging economies, but we also have seen a period of historically extraordinary economic growth globally, which has led to a rebalancing, if I may put it that way, of the relationship between the public and the private. After all, most of that growth takes place in terms of the growth of markets. And again, when you get an unbalancing of the relationship between public and private, that is prime territory for asking questions about the new rules of the game. What are the rules of the game when that power distribution changes? Thirdly, we are living in a period where, for the first time, there is the emergence of a class of development challenges which require collective responses. Pandemics, climate change, whatever, you name it, otherwise known as global public goods. Excuse me. And again, it's kind of self-evident that if you need to reach a collective solution, if you need a collective response to get to a solution, then you have to reach an agreement on the rules of the game that allow you to do the collective response. That's another pressure point for asking fundamental questions about norms. And lastly, the extraordinary developments, the rapid acceleration of technological change is also kind of prime ground for asking basic questions about norms, values, and whatever. So there are plenty of reasons, and I'm sure everybody would have their own list, as to why we see this issue so vibrant today. Second point I'd like to make is that before getting too excited, I think the UN system needs to do a bit of house cleaning that would reflect the importance of this issue. Maybe house cleaning is the wrong word. Soul searching might be more nicer way to put it. And I would point to, again, 3 areas which I think need attention. The first is that if you look at the structuring of the system, the way it's organized, it is actually organized on the principle that one part of the UN does norms and another part does operations. It is actually built into the last major reforms that we have completely separated and distinctive functions along those lines. Surely it is now time to ask the question whether that conception of how to organize ourselves is the appropriate one. Second point, with the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation in partnership with the Multi-Partner Trust Fund Office, we started issuing a report on the financing for development last year. There's another one this year. We're going to do it in the future. And one of the things that we wanted to do was to get analytical and get into the issue of the financing and the categorization of the normative activities of the United Nations. We assumed that since this was a really important issue and everybody was excited about it, we'd be able to figure out what actually was going on, what was being spent. Well, the statistics don't exist, basically. There is a column in the Chief Executive Board statistics that are provided. There's a column that says normative activities, and that, I was politely told, was essentially a dump category for agencies that didn't quite know where to put different types of expenditures. That may be a little bit unfair, but it is actually what I was told. If you believe that you get what you measure, then there's reason to be worried about that. And I think we need to look seriously at how we account for and how we cover normative activities. And then finally, and very briefly, we also need to, it seems to me, find a way of having a good dialogue on the appropriate financing for norms. This is a subject which has come up in the UN reform context. If you believe that norms are global, then you need to find a form of financing which is appropriate to that belief and doesn't depend on a couple of people being interested in a particular norm. That leads me to the final comment that I'd like to make, which is that, generally speaking, in our work on this, we would suggest that it's time for a broad-based strategy that will help to identify and address some of the key gaps that now exist in the way we deal with the normative agenda. The first is the need for UN leadership to embrace a powerful normative narrative. At a time when there is this incredible backlash, populist movement, Trumpism, yes, I'm going to name it, going along, a lot of this type of work, the kind of rules of the game of globalization, are associated with elites in their playground, doing their thing, which is definitely not in the interest of the common, of the normal person. And yet, I think we know that much of this normative work is actually the foundation for an inclusive and managed form of globalization. So this is really, I think, a missing narrative. It needs to come into the heart of the messaging in the UN. And by the way, I would also suggest that it's a missed opportunity for one of the fundamental core cases for the value of multilateralism itself, which in a way Henrik kind of alluded to. Very quickly, and then I'll end, a couple of other gaps. There is the gap, there are some gaps in the normative architecture itself. I think, for example, I think Ambassador Stour will be talking a little bit about issues a little bit related to that in one form or another. And there is also the issue, again, of the appropriate financing and getting into the financing discussion on norms. And then finally, there is what I would refer to as the need for mainstreaming the normative agenda. There is a need to integrate the transition from norms to integrating it into policy, to integrating it into implementation, and then you need integrated structures that can support you to do that. So we offer up, not as anything in any way definitive, but as a couple of suggestions, a number of gaps that we think need to be identified and addressed. And we hope very much that today will be a little contribution to that discussion, and that will generate some new ideas and be able to come up with a more robust kind of framing of the issue. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. And with this very thorough and sort of descriptive introduction, and I'm impressed. You started off by saying that it would be three. You had three things to say. I think I'm up to 19 now. But we'll now turn to our discussants, and we'll open up with the first panel. So let me welcome up on stage to manage the first panel, Lisa Orenius from the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation. Lisa is responsible for our program on renewal of the United Nations Development System. She's also head of our New York office. Lisa, welcome up and bring your discussants with you.
Sit whichever order you would like. Great. Good afternoon. So I am Lisa Orenius, and I've already been introduced. I will moderate this first panel, which with the title Agenda 2030 and the UN's normative role. And in this session, we will look specifically at the new, fairly new, a year plus 2030 agenda, and what it implies for UN in terms of its normative role. And I'm joined here by four eminent panelists. We have Nikhil Seth, who is Executive Director of UNITAR. We have Stephen Brown, who is the Co-Director of Future United Nations Development System, the FUNDS program. We have Virginia Kram-Martos, Director, Economic Cooperation and Trade Division at the UN Economic Commission for Europe. And we have Jill Carbonnier, Professor of Development Economics here at the Graduate Institute. The 2030 Agenda has been showered by superlatives: groundbreaking, unprecedented, transformative, a fundamental shift of ambition. It's a lot to live up to. The agenda, as we've heard in the introduction, has clear normative underpinnings, which raises both a number of opportunities and challenges. One issue for discussion, and I'm sure we will hear more about this in all the panels today, is if implementation of the agenda necessitates any updating or new norms, or if the existing norms are enough or more than enough. Other questions amount: what are the normative implications of the 17 SDGs on the UN operationally? Is the UN up for the task and ready and able? Are new approaches or instruments needed? This session now, I hope, will give us some answers to these questions. We will begin the structure of this panel, and the next panel we will begin with very short remarks from the 4 panelists, after which we will turn and have an open discussion and hopefully great interaction with all of you. There is great knowledge and interest, I think, here in the room as well. So do please be prepared with your own comments and input. We are really aiming for as interactive discussion as possible. We have 2 voices from within the UN system. We have Nikhil and Virginia, and 2 from outside, formally from inside, but we have Stephen and Jill. I will start with you, Nikhil, and I'd like you to ask you the specific question of what does the 2030 Agenda imply for the UN's normative role or normative work?
Thank you, Lisa. And given the ration of time, I will answer your question by addressing 3 questions, actually. One, what is really the normative role in addition to what Bruce and Thomas mentioned? And I think one of them is rather important, which I will talk about. The second is, did Agenda 2030 really set new norms, or did it just bring together established norms in the economic, social, environmental side, and of course for the creation of peaceful and just societies? And in the light of the focus on implementation of Agenda 2030, what is the future balance that we need in the work of the United Nations in the establishment and setting up of new norms and standards, on implementation, monitoring, and review? So I'll answer your question through my sort of reflections on these 3 questions. First, on the conceptual side, yes, the UN is the prime place where reflections and it unfolds really the establishment of norms. Is the primary place for that. But norms, as understood among the development side, apart from what is done in the standing bodies of the UN, by the Charter, of course, by the Secretary General, who sometimes gets ignored in this process, by the Standing General Assembly, Security Council, the other principal organs. There's one very important thing that has happened from the 90s, which is the World Conferences, which have helped establish a very strong normative agenda for the UN. And this is on the development of the agenda side, which I want to focus on. And these summits have been special because they've brought, of course, heads of state. They've got a focus on the media. They've been able to generate a lot of interest. So sometimes we forget the important role of the World Conferences in generating this. And therefore, the normative role, of course, includes hard law. It includes the conventions, treaties. It includes soft law. It includes especially the outcomes of the World Conferences. But I'll use, for working purposes of the rest of what I have to say, is the definition which is captured in your concept note, that the normative role includes the development of norms, it includes support to national legislation, it is support to enhance capacity building, and in helping monitoring and review for compliance of the norms that are adopted, particularly in light of Agenda 2030, the focus at the national level, which I think is the key to success of what we'll achieve by 2030. Second question is, did Agenda 2030 establish new norms, or really it just brought together everything that existed at that point of time? Here, I would say that there is not one instance of any of those targets falling below established norms when it was agreed to in 2015. In fact, 21 of these targets were specially pulled out because member states felt that these don't either exceed ambition as set out in the treaties and conventions, and therefore were little violative of the principles of convention and treaties, or they were below the standards in soft law. So 21 targets at the last stages of this game were tweaked to make sure that none of them are below standards that have already been achieved. So I would say that in no case is any of the goal or any of the targets established in the 2030 agenda below norms that were extant at the time the agenda was adopted. In fact, most of the soft law, whether it was eradicating poverty in all its forms everywhere, its universality of this agenda, the health issues, every goal you'll see has gone beyond soft law. The only goals and targets which are really not beyond what had been established at that date were essentially those which are treaty bound, which were referring once again to, say, the marine ecosystem or the terrestrial ecosystem, where the General Assembly felt we should not go beyond what the treaties have already established. So in most cases, I would say it's an ambitious agenda, it's a transformational agenda, but the most important thing of this agenda was bringing these things together. These things which have been dealt with in different dedicated processes, whether they were huge summits or in different parts of the UN system, these were brought together as never before. So the main thing that the 2030 agenda achieved was to go beyond most things in the social issues, in economic issues. In the environmental side, I would say we more or less subject to what was extant in environmental law. We haven't gone beyond in any of the environmental issues. On climate, we left it all to the Paris process because the feeling was that that's the authoritative place where the development of climate law would take place. So this is what I feel about Agenda 2030 and extant law, and how it has gone way beyond in most of its content from anything that was existing in the softer parts of legislation in the United Nations. Now, what is the future of normative work? Now, normative work has been defined in a very broad way. It's not only the development of law, but implementation, of monitoring and review. I would argue this: enough of an overemphasis on the development of norms. We've done that now for a very long time. And a greater focus is needed on the implementation, review, and monitoring side. If there is a trade-off to be made, we have to convert our system into focusing much more on implementation. I'd like to talk a little more on this, but I know my time is limited. Let me give some examples. In the GA and intergovernmental bodies, we spend an inordinate amount of time on policy development. We will look for new things to say on these issues, on gender, on poverty, on health. But is our time better spent on looking at implementation? Are the reports we get focusing on what is happening on the issues we've already legislated on, rather than creating new space for policy development? Of course, these have to move hand in hand, but I would argue that in looking at this whole scope of things, from policy development to implementation to monitoring and review, let's focus on implementation. Let's focus on legislating these norms and helping poor countries realize these through a very different approach. Many of the gaps which Bruce spoke of, I think in the light, if we were as one in the UN system, focusing on implementation, we'd find some of these gaps disappear. And one of the most important gaps is getting expertise, which is non-resident, to the country level, so that the best possible expertise on these issues become parts of national planning, become parts of national statistical systems, become parts of national stakeholder engagement. So that's where I think we need to go. What Agenda 2030, the whole process taught me, is that engagement was key to its success. And how do we get that engagement, especially of academia and business sector and its implementation? For that, there's a fundamental rethink required in the UN system, in the way we operate, in the way we implement legislation, and how we interface with these other communities out there. And that has to be the focus on implementation. Thank you, Lisa.
Thank you so much, Nikhil. Stephen, I will add to your question, actually. Now, I would like to ask you two things. First, whether you agree with Nikhil's assessment of enough with the development of new norms, focus on implementation, despite Nikhil saying that the 2030 agenda goes beyond established targets and norms, so it's more ambitious than what we have for the moment. And then I want to ask you as well whether where you see UN's comparative advantage in the area of norms, and whether you think that UN is up for the task.
Okay, Good afternoon. It seems to work, seems to turn itself on if I say good afternoon. Well, you've given me two additional questions. I will react to what Nikhil has said, but we have 3 questions in 5 minutes, and I would like to make 4 points, if I may, which will cover what you have asked for. Let me start with the first point, which is universality. And as others have already said, the UN is, of course, the primary forum for the agreement of universal standards and goals, starting in 1945 with the Charter, with its own values, moving on to 1948 with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, right up to the present time, not forgetting that in Kigali, a couple of months ago, the vast majority of the UN membership agreed to new norms and standards to eliminate gradually hydrofluorocarbons to save the planet for the second time under the Montreal Protocol. So it's the universal forum, but it doesn't have an exclusive role in terms of norms and standards, as we know. Which brings me to my second point. I have a slightly different categorization of norms and standards from Tom. I will come on to the behavioral in a moment, which I have not subdivided into prescriptive and non-prescriptive. But I want to start with the technical standards and norms for which many parts of the UN, particularly the specialized agencies, are best known. WHO, of course, with its health standards, ILO with its labor standards, FAO with food safety and other standards, the transport and communications area, which includes many of the other specialized agencies, UPU, ITU, many of them, of course, based in Geneva, which I think could be designated as the norm center. But for another reason, because not very far from where we are sitting is the ISO, perhaps the best known technical norm standard organization in the world, the International Organization for Standardization, which I think proves that there is no monopoly in the UN on such technical standards. Because the ISO is not strictly, or not only intergovernmental, it includes, of course, private sector and non-governmental interests as well. But the other category is the important one, and this is where brings me to comment on what Nikhil has said, and that's the behavioral norms, in the way that has already been described by Tom. And the behavioral norms is where I think the UN probably should have a monopoly in the important context of development. And the behavioral norms, of course, include areas such as human rights, discrimination, the problems of gender, the challenges of gender parity, all aspects which I think are very important for the UN to entrepreneur and to spread, and I'll come in a moment to the ways in which I think that can be done. But that brings me to my third point, which is on the SDGs. And I agree with Nikhil that there was nothing new in the SDGs. Perhaps if there's any disappointment in the SDGs, it is that it did rehash many of that first type of norms and standards, but it didn't say nearly enough about those other behavioral norms. It didn't say enough about human rights. It didn't say enough about discrimination. It didn't say enough about the other huge challenges which the world is facing, like forced migration, cybersecurity, terrorism. So it was, for me, forgive me, I think it was a partial agenda. And that brings me to my last point, which is addressing the question which you'd put in the agenda, Lisa. Is the UN up for the task? Now, there's a nice ambiguity in the preposition there. I don't know if the UN is up for the task. The for that implies a certain willingness. Is the UN up to the task? Is probably the more relevant question. Is it, in other words, capable of the task? And this is where I have to agree with what Nikhil has said. There's probably, with certain gaps acknowledged, there are probably enough norms in the behavioral and the technical sense for the UN to be working with. But the UN development system, which I've been studying for many years, both inside and outside, has become a kind of bifurcated system of ideas and research which lead to those norms and treaties and conventions. And on the other side, the operations. And ne'er the twain seem to meet. And so the answer to the question is the way forward for the UN is, and this is where I agree with what Nikhil has said, much more time should be spent in operations on helping governments to become compliant with what they have already agreed under UN auspices. And compliance is widely abused at the moment, or widely ignored, unfortunately. If the operational side of the UN can help move from the norms that have been agreed among 193 countries in an intergovernmental context to national legislation, to results on the ground, which will imply active and vibrant and meaningful monitoring systems, then I think that would be the way forward for the UN.
Thank you so much. Virginia, I will now turn to you. You your organization, the European Economic Commission for Europe, is a regional and multidisciplinary organization. What does that, what challenges does that, do you have in working with norms in your normative role?
Well, I think I should use a microphone. Well, my organization works in the area that Stephen just mentioned about. Our focus is primarily on the technical standards. And I think that this is closely linked to the issue of implementation. Because, I mean, you'd probably be amazed. I'll go through a few examples of the kind of standards that we develop. For example, we are responsible for the global regulatory framework for vehicles. So that means, how do you get less CO2, less pollution? It's through standards for vehicles. How do you ensure that the new electronic vehicles are safe? It's through standards for vehicles. We have the TIR Convention for transit to reduce the cost so that landlocked countries can participate fully in trade. We have agricultural quality standards that you see every day in Europe in the grocery stores, which help to reduce, although actually, food waste by ensuring that when people order merchandise, they can define what they're getting. And also we develop electronic commerce standards. And among those standards, we have electronic commerce standards for all of the certificates that you need for trade in agricultural produce. For example, phytosanitary certificates, lab certificates, as well as other kinds of merchandise. We develop standards for trade facilitation, such as for the implementation of single windows. Our statistics has been very active, our statistics division, in the development of statistical norms for measuring the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, we have one of our challenges is, how do we do all this work with a staff in all of these areas with a staff of 200 people? We do this through using the expertise of countries, of experts, of technical experts, who contribute their time and knowledge, and where we play primarily a coordinating role, and where the types of norms and standards that we develop come up from the bottom, or from the countries, in terms of what they would like to have seen, to see done. But another one of our challenges, and this is a big challenge for us in particular, is that in norms and standards, the value of a norm or standard, and this goes across any norm or standard, is how many people use it. If you have a standard that's used by 10 countries or 10 companies, the value is much, much less than if it's 100 countries or 100 or 10,000 companies that are using your norm and standard. So how do you ensure that or create the greatest value? And in certain areas, for example, in the electronic commerce standards or in the global vehicles standards, or I'm sure maybe you have noticed whenever there's a truck that has dangerous goods on it, they have one of these orange plaques on the back with numbers that tell you exactly what dangers are involved, so that if there's an accident, the emergency responders can respond appropriately. Those are developed by us, but they're developed by mechanisms that over the years have turned into global mechanisms. So we're actually a regional organization with parts of our work that are focused only on the region, and then we have other parts of the work that are focused globally, because it makes no sense to have an electronic commerce standard that's local, to have a standard on vehicle construction standards that's only local. So we have a challenge in terms of partnerships, in terms of developing these and ensuring the access and the participation at a global level. And I have to say also that we're very proud of this role that we have, and I'm very proud to work for an organization with this role within the UN system, because I feel and my staff feel that every day, and the things that we create and the results that we get are things that people can use in concrete ways every day. And to contribute to this in Geneva, because Geneva is really a hub for the standards development within the UN system. And being located here in Geneva has helped us a great deal in terms of achieving our objectives, because when there is the ISO here, and I have a working party that's meeting this week on regulatory cooperation and standardization policies, which looks specifically at how you work together with standards organizations and how governments can use standards to promote their objectives, their policy objectives. And we have all of these, we have the ISO is just one. There are a number of other standards organizations here in Geneva. There's the World Trade Organization, the International Trade Center. I could name, 10 at least organizations in Geneva that are norm-setting organizations, and being located here allows us to build upon these partnerships.
Thank you. Can I perhaps maybe stop you there? I forgot actually to say in the beginning that I have a cowbell here. We're giving a little bit of Swiss flair to this conference since we are so short of time, but thank you for keeping the time. I was almost about to reach for it. Thank you so much, Virginia, for talking a little bit more about some of the practical normative work, technical normative work can look like. Lastly, I will turn to Jill before turning to all of you to hear. We're really eager to hear your thoughts and comments. But coming back and looking back again at the 2030 agenda, Jill, what do you see in terms of normative change as being new with this agenda? And do you think it rests on existing frameworks, or does it require any change from state and non-state actors to uphold and promote the international standards?
Thank you, Lisa. I will try to address your question by making a number of points. I didn't count them, so they will be anywhere between 3 and 19, as Bruce Yanks was saying before. But I'd like to start by... please use the cowbell. I'm Swiss, so you can use it without any problem. I'd like to start by a concern that Thomas Biestiger, but then also Nikhil, Stephen, mentioned is the question of, well, we have maybe enough norms, we really need to enforce them, and it's constant renegotiation and efforts to enforce them. And I think that we all can and should be deeply concerned about the fact that over the past few years, fundamental norms of humanity, the most basic ones, are egregiously violated. We see a rise in the number and intensity of war crimes, well, be it in Iraq, Syria, in Yemen. And this takes place, or Afghanistan, and this takes place in a context where actually a majority of the permanent members of the UN Security Council are militarily engaged. And the systematic attacks on health facilities, on medical personnel, has become a deliberate strategy used by state and non-state actors alike. And this goes on, and unfortunately, we don't see any end in sight. So we see an erosion of basic norms that have been established in the direct aftermath of World War II. And the question is, well, how can the UN, with its structure and its Security Council, come to grip with those norms that we should start with, which are very prescriptive in a sense, to paraphrase Tom Bierstecker. And the same applies to, since we are in Geneva, to the 1951 Refugee Convention, where we see that even European states have been calling into question the Refugee Convention and not applying it and the provisions. So I would like to say that in this framework, the unanimous adoption of the SDGs last year by all member states of the UN is no small miracle. And it provides us, an aspiration, a vision for the future, for collective action. And as you mentioned, Lisa, it's multi-layered, different actors, state and non-state actors, and different level of governance. And there I'd like to focus maybe a bit on the role of the private sector, because again, it's been in the narrative on the SDGs, we have heard again and again that the private sector has a key role to play in terms of course, job creation, economic growth, creativity, but also behavioral change. And when we look at the private sector and the role of the UN and the SDGs, I would say the SDGs are how can the business sector do good? What would be the positive responsibilities? And what are the, it sets a common framework, a common language to engage across sectors, also the business sector. But of course, again, it's been reaffirmed that it would not offset the responsibility of the business sector to respect and uphold fundamental norms of human rights. And that's doing good by engaging in favor of the 2030 agenda is certainly welcome, but it's not a way to compensate what some have called the negative responsibility of business, which is to respect human rights. And there, the UN guiding principle that have been adopted in 2011, it's very interesting because if you see how they came into being and how they are being implemented, and I think this is where we can learn a bit from this exercise. After deadlock, we have seen a number, in the beginning of the 2000s, we have seen a number of multi-stakeholder governance initiatives, like the Voluntary Principle on Security and Human Rights, which actually developed outside of the UN framework, which engaged major oil and mining firms, and which, I would say, through a social learning exercise, brought business into the discussion on fundamental human rights. At the same time, these multi-stakeholder initiatives built on norms that had been elaborated and adopted within the UN framework. And years later, it came back here in Geneva by the adoption when the UN Human Rights Council adopted the UN guiding principles. It came back into the UN framework. And what is very interesting is that most of the multi-stakeholder initiatives were mainly Western-led. And the BRICS countries, China, India, Brazil, are very reluctant and usually do not participate in those multi-stakeholder initiatives, which are seen as very much Western liberal inspiration. And the role of the UN here is to bring back this universal character of the responsibility of business to respect human rights. And I think this is something to be seen, because through the learning exercise, I think that we have found behavioral pathways to change the behavior of business and to bring the issue of human rights at board level as something which is the business of business, which was contested a few years back. So just to conclude, before you ring the bell, maybe I'd like to conclude by saying that when we look at the SDGs, I think it provides a very welcome common narrative, common framework with a sense of common purpose between states and different non-state actors to instruct both partnerships, but also controversies and political discussions between the different partners. And what I would like just to highlight is that in terms of implementation, we can certainly have the business using I would say, their expertise in establishing key performance indicators, in monitoring those key performance indicators, for instance, through the Global Reporting Initiative, where for years now, major companies, multinational companies, do report on environmental and social performance, including through quantitative indicators. But the big issue is, how is it monitored? How is it audited by third parties? And how do we engage in cases where we see that the enforcement does not contribute to the Agenda 2030?
Thank you so much. Thank you all for providing some answers and some of your thoughts to all these questions, and adding a lot more questions, I think, in your own remarks. I have a number of questions, but I'd like to hear from our audience here. Any thoughts? I'm sure you have lots to say. We have two mics that we can hand around. We have one in the middle and one up. I see a gentleman in a purple sweater.
Good afternoon. I'm Wouter van Ginneke from an NGO here, ATD Fourth World. I would like to make a comment on accountability, because, Bruce Jenks, he talked about the fact that basically there should be UN leadership, let's say, on the normative talk. Nigel Setti talks about the implementation. And Stephen Brown, he talks about human rights, and he feels that that is not sufficiently into it. And then the question is the UN up to it? Well, the question is not really whether the UN is up to it. The question is whether the countries are up to it. So if they set a standard, which they have as the SDGs, are they accountable? I think that is the key question, in my view. Are they, as a result of the normative that they have put together, are they accountable? Let me give you an example. On the target on SDG 3, you have that all people should be covered by health insurance. Now, we have one indicator which says, well, are people covered? Okay, that you can measure. But if you want to have a human rights indicator of that, then you say, well, are the resources there in order to make sure that everybody are covered by health insurance? And third point, and there the human rights issue comes in, is there a legal framework where people can claim their rights? So in other words, in my view, the key question is not, is the UN up to it, but whether the states are up to their accountability.
Thank you. We'll take a couple of more. Yes, right up there. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Daphne Gönenç, I'm a PhD student in political science at the Institute. You have very rightly indicated and underlined the importance of norm implementation and the gap between normative commitment and implementation. However, we also need to realize that there is actually a clash and contestation between certain norms, and this is partially why some of the norms are not being implemented. Take, for instance, poverty reduction, environmental promotion, or social cohesion. How can we really achieve those norms, those goals, if we continuously, take free trade and unquestionable growth as our goals? Like they are not really actually compatible goals if we try to commit ourselves both of them at the same time. So we might actually need new norms. And we might need to discuss about them. So my question is, to what extent, for instance, United Nations discussing about a new norm such as degrowth, is it on the agenda at all? What about environmental rights? Or what about basic income? I know that to a certain extent discussions about basic income now on the table, but how about degrowth, for instance? Thank you.
Thank you. Great comment. Right in the front here. Great. Take this last one, and then we'll turn to the panelists.
Yes, thank you very much. Before I raise my questions, let me share my reflections with you.
Can you please introduce, sorry.
My name is Riyad Bazia, and the independent consultant based in Geneva. I am since a long time with civil society. Then I understand that the foundations are more dedicated for norms and the SDGs. But we should know that nowadays we are living steps and targets, and it started since MDGs, since the new millennium. And the international negotiations now are crucially, especially with negotiation on trade. So the challenge started also with the Kyoto Protocol, because 2012 it was a target, but didn't be achieved. So 2015 also it was a target, and we got the Paris Accord. And we have also another target, another step, which is 2020 on biodiversity, should be reached. And later, 2013. As I hear from the panel, that international organizations such as ISO, it's dedicated on standardization. It's true, but these specific international organizations, members are not states. Members are national society of standardizations. And some, they are too big to fail. They come to sell their own project, which is a legal product standardizations. Because also in WTO, the challenge is on public health, and WHO mandate is public health, and it is food security, and it is also regulation and standardization. There is standardization, norm standards department in WTO. Because the information society process nowadays, it's normative process. And it is annual meeting in ITU, International Telecommunication Union. But before I raise my question, let me say that such as UNDP, and you know very well UNDP, UNITAR is the UN secretariat dedicated on training. And nowadays, in WIPO, there is an academy, World International Intellectual Property Academy, worldwide. ITU, they launched the Academy, the WMO, also Academy. So the standard is normative for training, technical training. And my question, it is on regulations, because nowadays we talk standardization and to be regulator. So the regulator authorities are also on telecommunication, regulator authorities to have an access to drugs product, but normative and the regulations, how can you see the regulatory we can implement regulatory authorities or just regulator? Thank you very much.
Thank you. So we have, there were two comments first, and then two questions or comments, and then comment, and I think a question at the end here about regulations and norms. So I heard the first question was related to particularly to accountability, and the question shouldn't so much be is the UN up to it, but are countries up to it? Stephen, would you like to answer that one?
I think the point you raised is very important. Accountability can be enhanced through active monitoring. And I think this is where the UN has fallen down in many areas, but not all. I think when the the Commission on Human Rights was recast as the Council on Human Rights, the Human Rights Council in about 10 years ago, it developed the Universal Periodic Review. Now, it's by no means perfect, but it is an opportunity to hold governments to account admittedly through a process of peer review by other governments, which are chosen on a fairly arbitrary basis. But it does also allow citizens through NGOs to have a say and to make presentations when the Universal Periodic Review comes up for that country. My quarrel with the UN is that there isn't enough examples of a UPR in other areas. Take one area which I should have mentioned but didn't. The SDGs say practically nothing at all about one of the most critical development areas of all, without which development will not proceed, and that's corruption. Unless countries get on top of the problem of corruption, then obviously many other things in development will not happen. When you think, for example, that for corruption and other reasons, there is something like $500 billion leaving the African continent of potentially of development funds every year, you begin to realize the scale of the problem and why it's important. Now, the UN has a convention against corruption, and it has a monitoring system. But as Transparency International said recently, it doesn't work. The only published results, I think, out of 193 countries on corruption, I think are 15 that happen to be on the UNCAC website. There are two problems with this, and I think they both have to be addressed. The first is that the convention is too perfect. I don't think there's not Switzerland, not Singapore, not Norway. I think there's scarcely any country in the world could accede and comply fully with everything in that UNCAC. However, so in other words, there should be metrics by which countries can accede gradually to improve their records on corruption. But the other thing that's wrong is that there isn't an adequately powerful monitoring system. And I think if there's one lesson that the UN can learn, it's that it has to set up proper monitoring systems to ensure compliance.
Thank you. Anybody else in the panel that want to comment on the same? Otherwise, Nikhil, did you want to comment on the second question or this one?
Well, I could just add to this by saying,
No, go ahead.
that the SDG outcome is a solemn commitment signed by 169 heads of state and government who are present physically there to sign off on it. In the outcome is also the process for review and monitoring. But the tragedy is that the countries who have to review and monitor, they don't have the capacity to do so. I deal with 100 very distressed countries emerging from conflict, LDC, small island developing states. And if I have to tell them whether they've put their monitoring processes, they say we just don't have the statistical capacity to measure the indicators. Can the UN help us build those statistical capacities? So I never said stop policy development from the normative development side. What I'm saying is we have to recalibrate the time and attention we spend to the tasks we have on policy, on normative development, on implementation, on review and monitoring, in favor of implementation. Otherwise, we'll never get the equation right at the country level. So, of course, countries are themselves accountable, but we have to help them in carrying out their responsibilities to that, so that they can monitor whether they are making progress along the 240 indicators, which everyone is promising to monitor. I've just come back from Sweden. Sweden told me that in Sweden, they have only statistics to monitor 70 of the 240 indicators. So clearly, every country has a lot to do, but for these 100 distressed countries, unless we can shift the balance in favor of implementation, we are never going to be able to create that capacity for these countries to be able to going along the path. They need plans which integrate SDGs. They need statistics to measure implementation. They need mechanisms for stakeholder participation. This is an agenda for all. But we are not used in the UN. We're still suspicious. How do we deal with the business sector? We still don't know how to deal with civil society to make them positive agents of change in the societies and countries where they work. So there's a lot of fundamental rethinking we need to do. On the question of, so UN, our role is to help countries and to the extent possible. And that's what the new orientation, I think, of our work has to be. So many people have talked about the link between the normative and operational. That's what I mean. How do we get the balance right in favor of helping these 100 countries get to where we want them to reach?
Thank you. We also had a question with a clash between certain norms. And does that mean that you need new norms? Regina, did you want to pick up on that issue, or did you want to comment on this first question?
Well, I wanted to comment on the first question first very quickly. From an internal standpoint, I can see inside of the UN system that at the moment there's a tremendous emphasis on developing indicators. And because, as Nicole just said, even Sweden can't measure everything. And there's a need to develop indicators where you can compare across countries where they're measuring the same things. And in some areas, for example, violence against women, how you measure it, you have to measure it in more or less the same way for the statistics to be comparable. And there's a tremendous emphasis at the moment on this issue of monitoring and measuring. And we've, in the past, and we continue to do a lot of work in the norms development. But I agree completely that what is getting neglected, because you have a implementation and monitoring, but now I see all of the emphasis, or 90% of the emphasis, on the monitoring. And that's fine for developed countries and countries that have the resources to implement. But what about these 100 countries that not only do they need a lot of capacity building and assistance for the monitoring, but what are you going to monitor if you don't have the resources for the implementation and you don't have the tools for the implementation? We need to give them also the tools and the support for the implementation.
Thank you. So, Jill, do you want to tackle the question on the clash between certain norms? And yeah.
With pleasure, yeah. Just to say, we had a conference here it was in June, on the monitoring and implementing the SDGs that we organized with the International Development Policy Journal, and our keynote speaker, colleague Jean-Louis Arcan, called to sign a non-proliferation treaty on indicators, to say we have too many out there, we just have to have less of them, but which are meaningful and used by policymakers. And we had, I think in this seat here, a former Minister of Finance of Peru, an academic now, and he was saying, well, you know, the MDGs was never a topic in parliament and within government in Peru, and we just discovered that we almost made it after 15 years, and we got the medal, simply because the prices of minerals went up, but this was not a theme. So when it comes to accountability and states being accountable, I think the SDGs are different from the MDGs because the process of designing them has been much more participatory, and we want to engage, and we have to engage civil society organizations, international NGOs, cities, the private sector, and so forth. So coming to the question of contradiction, it's true if you look at the 17 SDGs, depending whether you are a techno-optimist or a techno-pessimist, you can see real tensions and contradictions between, for instance, the objective that says we have now to adopt sustainable production and sustainable consumption patterns, and the other objective, which is to boost economic growth in a world which is, moving towards 9 billion people. So indeed, there are trade-offs which are different if you are Burkina Faso or Switzerland. And I think these trade-offs needs to be discussed under a question of policy coherence for sustainable development. The OECD does some work and has been doing some work on policy coherence. Policies are incoherent by nature, but how can you try to discuss, have some democratic deliberations on how to deal with such trade-offs and inconsistencies? And I'd like to just conclude by coming back to the question of financing, which, Stephen, you have brought up. I think financing the SDGs is one area where we have seen a clash between developing countries and industrial countries in Addis Ababa during the third conference on financing for development, where the big issue is that we know that foreign aid will not cover more than 3-4% of the total cost of implementing the SDGs. So 97 or 96% has to come from mainly domestic resources. So then the question of the, the erosion of the tax base, the shifting of profit out of country where value is created is a huge issue. And here in Geneva, Switzerland and in the UK and elsewhere, the question of how to deal with these tensions between promoting the vibrancy of financial and commodity trading hubs, and at the same time working towards a world where developing countries are themselves able to generate the resources required to implement the SDGs is a huge topic, and it is a political debate and a political discussion and struggle, after all, where different stakeholders have to come to the fore.
Thank you so much. Well, time flies when you have fun, right? I know that there are lots of some more comments and questions. Our time is up. We want to make sure that we do leave a lot of time for the next panel that we will have. We'll look at specific case studies and specific issues to make this a little bit more concrete. What are we talking about? So, and we did want to, this is a long afternoon, and we did want to treat you to some coffee. So there is a short coffee break now, which is extremely short, 15 minutes. We will bring the cowbell up. But do save your questions and comments. There will be plenty of more opportunity to comment and to ask questions in this following panel and the session after that. These all sessions sort of blend into each other, and they're part of sort of one theme. So please hold on to your questions. And thank you so much to the panelists.
Thank you, Lisa. Lisa, I have to go to the German mission to sign in.
Hello? Just the coffee, I should say where you can find the coffee. If you go up the stairs, there are signs. You just need to just go into the adjacent building right here. It's 30 seconds up. So grab a quick coffee and then come back down.
Okay, if we can ask everyone to take their seats, please. Ils sont frais. Les verres. Oui, oui, absolument. Ouais, ouais. Okay, we will get started on the second panel. If everybody can take their seats. Thank you. My name is Cecilia Cannon. I'm Head of Research here at the Graduate Institute for the Programme for the Study of International Governance. Welcome back. Thank you for being quite punctual. I know that the cowbell is quite effective in getting everyone back on time. But it's great so that we can dive into the second panel, which is rich not only in the lineup of the speakers that we have, but also in the topics that will be covered. So this panel will focus on the United Nations normative role in practice. We'll be discussing 4 pressing global challenges facing the international community today, where we are seeing existing normative frameworks challenged, new normative frameworks being created or adjusted, and some areas where there are still some gaps in the normative architecture. We've asked our panelists to think about how the United Nations system implements its normative work practically, to assess the challenges in integrating normative and operational aspects, and already linking that back to panel 1, trying to move from normative versus operational to seeing how it can be transformed into normative, the normative aspects can be transformed into the operational areas. And we're also looking at areas where the United Nations agencies and programs can improve their normative response to international disasters and crises. So first we will be looking at labour and safety standards, a topic that raises important questions, particularly in relation to the application and implementation of normative frameworks throughout global supply chains, operating in local contexts around the world. And that links back to something that was raised in the first panel on the issue of accountability, when you're really looking at global supply chains. Second, we will look at the World Health Organization's normative role in responding to and addressing health outbreaks, and some lessons learned with the Ebola outbreak. Third, we will turn to the issue of, or the topic area of international migration, where there is yet a striking gap in terms of international normative frameworks for a phenomenon that is, by its very definition, transcend national sovereign borders. So we're seeing with migration, on the one hand, wheels set in motion to fill these normative gaps, with the International Organization for Migration formally becoming a related organization to the United Nations in September of this year, and also with the General Assembly recently adopting the New York Declaration for Refugees and Migrants, and the development of a global compact for safe, regular, orderly migration, which will be considered for adoption in 2018. And yet alongside these steps to create the needed normative frameworks at the international level, we're also seeing existing norms that was mentioned by Gilles in the first panel, such as the Refugee Convention, being challenged in some parts of the world, evident through increasingly restrictive border policies, and also which is reflected in the public opinion that does not wholly support the existing bedrock normative frameworks for migration. Moving on from there, we will also look at resource conservation and the cross-sectoral connections it has, impacting on the social agenda, and how global norms are often used by civil society to advocate and defend rights at local levels. So we've asked our panelists to keep their framing remarks to 5 minutes. I'm going to be quite strict with our trusty little cowbell here. So then we can really open up the floor to have a dialogue with the many interesting people here in the audience. So it's now my pleasure to introduce the panelists. First, to discuss the Raza Plana garment factory collapse in Bangladesh, looking at labour and safety standards, we have Gilbert Huangbo, who's the Deputy Director General at the International Labour Organization. He'll be followed by Marie-Paul Keeney, who is the Assistant Director General for Health Systems and Innovation at the World Health Organization, and she will discuss the Ebola experience and the World Health Organization's normative role. We'll then look at migration and discuss the missing normative architecture and whether there is a missing normative architecture. And Carsten Stauer, Denmark's permanent representative to the United Nations in Geneva, will discuss that one. And finally, we'll look at resource conservation, a social agenda, and Professor Susanna Hecht, who is a professor of international history here at the Graduate Institute, will talk to us about that. So please welcome Mr. Gilbert Huangbo.
Thank you so much, and thank you for inviting us. Since we have 5 minutes, I'm going to go straight to the point. For the case of our experience in Bangladesh, when I was listening to the first panel, I was quite very interested. So my takeaway, I would like to be able to convince you this afternoon that we have to look at the SDGs in a way that we cannot achieve the SDGs if we underestimate the role of the norm, of the normative side. This is really the message. And what has happened in Bangladesh has shown us that after the collapse, and I have to preface that Bangladesh, it just happened to be Bangladesh. We have cases in Pakistan, we have different cases, so I don't want this to be seen as a Bangladesh issue. It's really a center. What we have noticed with more than 1,100 deaths, 2,500 injured, total compensation for close to 5,000 people, the absence of the norm has been the real issue. And interestingly, for us, ILO dealing with labor standard, dealing with the labor working relation, industrial relation, to find ourselves having to deal with construction norms, we find that very interesting. Of course, we have no experience and no mandate with that. We need to work with others. So what was at the core of the problem in Bangladesh was the fact that the construction code in itself was an issue. The fact that a lot of labor standards were not implemented, namely the freedom of association, collective bargaining, OSH, occupational safety and health, a lot of those issues. So part of the solution starts with a revision of the labor law, for example, and coming back to social dialogue, to all the normative side has been back of the solution. I also wanted to come back to one of the points. When you look at from the norm, me too, I'm not so sure I want to look at it from prescriptive and behavioral, but if you look at it, we can talk about some norms that maybe countries are reluctant to ratify or implement. Then there's second dimension, norms that countries might be in good faith, but are struggling to implement them. That's why we didn't talk a lot in the first panel. There's a lot of cases, and the case of Bangladesh, I believe we have both. And you can have circumstances when countries, a country like Bangladesh, if I recall very well, 130 million population, in 2013, the whole country had less than 100 labor inspectors. So that tells you about the capacity issue, which is also part of the challenge. So I want to insist that I do agree with one of the comments we get in the first panel, that it's not more norms, but how do we make the existing norms effective? How do we assist countries in moving forward in implementing those norms? One of the challenges also we had in Bangladesh is when we move to compensation. And again, the absence of norm, the absence of the existing modus operandi has been the challenge. We have our famous convention, 142, I think, or 141, on the compensation, yet the country does not have the ability to implement it. And again, that is part of the problem. Another point that I wanted to really insist on, yes, and there was a question that was raised with this regard by one of the doctorants. is that you might think that some of the objectives are contradictory. And if I take the case of Bangladesh, the garment sector we're talking about, that garment sector creates jobs for 4 million jobs, out of which 80% are for women. And out of that, we noticed that as the MDG's assessment, that has helped the country to increase the MDG indicator in terms of girls and boys attending at schools. The whole GDP is a huge. The garment sector went from export to Europe market, went for somewhere like 1 billion in the late 70s, early 80s, to 20 billion today. So you might think that, okay, because of the growth, the more you put emphasis on the growth, you want to ignore the labor-related standard, for example, minimum wage, the code, the working condition, and so forth. So what ILO has been able to demonstrate through a program that we call Better Work, for example, is that to the contrary, the more you spend time on making sure that you ratify and implement the norms, the more you gain in terms of productivity, and therefore also you gain much more market, because today most of the companies, especially in the supply chain, because of their responsibility, they want to make sure that where they are doing business, the countries or the companies, local companies, are abiding by the rules, are abiding by the existing norms. So my point here is that it might not necessarily be a contradiction between enforcing the norm, implementing them, and looking for other objectives such as the economic growth or inclusive growth. Just one last point, and I hope we'll have opportunity through questions to come back on that. The cooperation on the ground is still going to be cooperation among agencies, not only the UN, but also outside the UN, is still going to be critical. And what we have seen in the case of Bangladesh is to bring the UN side and to bring the traditional bilateral colleagues and the private sector local, the private sector international, the union local, the union international. And that has been quite interesting, a unique set to bring up for the solution. So that cooperation in implementing the norms is also going to be critical moving forward. Thank you.
Thank you. Raising some very interesting points. The first thing, you mentioned the absence of the norm, and it's really the absence of the implementation of the norm that we're seeing there. Another very interesting thing that I think you raised was the need to look at related norms that are not perhaps in your area of expertise. So for example, looking at the norms of construction and which norms need to be incorporated or connected and interlinked and have knock-on effects to actually address the implementation of the primary norms in question. And then also in terms of implementation and capacity deficits, I really hope that somebody from the audience might ask a question, and if not, I will ask it later, about the role of business and the accountability and the role in implementation that business should play, particularly in this area. So thank you. I now ask Marie-Paul Kenny to take the floor. Thank you.
Thank you very much. So looking at the role, traditional role of WHO, you can classify your activities in 3 categories. One is a norm setting function that we all know as quality of medicines, quality of food, and all this. The second is a role of technical assistance. So what is this really? This is about taking the norms and helping the countries in setting policies, in implementation, in monitoring. That's technical assistance. And then the other one is about operations in emergencies. So before Ebola, at one time, there was a discussion within WHO whether we should continue this role in emergencies. And there was a decision, and indeed, this was part of a mandate, and we needed to reinforce our capacity to act in emergencies. So when we talk about Ebola, we all think about, you know, these cosmonauts that we can see with strange clothing, people dying in the streets, awful pictures of these Ebola treatment centers. You know, norms. Many people, you know, were there norms there? Of course there were norms. And during 2014-15, it was crucial, it was a very crucial time for WHO to exercise its normative role in addition to responding to the outbreak. So what did we do? We issued at that time 45 guidance documents on such things like case management, a patient, what do you do? How do you try to save a patient? On protective equipment, on infection prevention control, on safe burials, on community engagement, on travel. And we try to base these guidance, these norms, as much as possible on evidence. But although Ebola was not a new disease, never had it been such a large outbreak and such an epidemic. So in many places, the evidence was lacking. So it was a question of having a trade-off between the best evidence that we could find and expert opinion. The guidance was produced in order to respond to the needs of the field and also to strengthen local capacity. There was a need during the epidemic to evolve and to adopt new norms. For example, we started a norm on safe burials, but this didn't go well, frankly, with communities, because they were safe, but they were not liked by the community. So we had to change them for norms on safe and dignified burials in order to take care of the needs of the population. So we had also to look at the dissemination of norms through networks, partners, and use of country, both for the response and also for training for pre-deployment of staff. We also had a role during the outbreak on R&D, and here also we needed to set norms such as the criteria for prioritization of product, target product profiles, ethical norms. This was a huge debate. Can you use or can you not use placebo in Ebola? Regulatory reviews, and also establishing a blueprint for for preparedness. So in conclusion, I think that WHO was well positioned, is well positioned to play a role, a critical normative role in an emergencies. And in an emergencies, actually, all the countries, even the rich countries, are looking at us at WHO and say, what is to be done? So we need also to take into consideration when setting norms important factors such as feasibility, logistics, market capacity, and so that these norms can be implemented by countries. So let me say my personal opinion is that currently there is too much push on WHO to become an emergency organization. And there's a risk. Yes, I understand that we need to be able to strengthen, and we're doing this, our capacity to respond. But if we are also the normative agency in health, and if not WHO, who could do this? Would you be happy to have the private sector set up norms on medicines, set up norms on food? How many corners would be set in order to increase the revenues and the profit? So this is an important role. In many areas, I think that implementation can be done by others. So I would hope that going forward, both in WHO and in the UN, the fundamental importance and our capacity to set up norms as they should be strengthened for the goal all of public good. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. And there's 30 seconds left, so I'm actually going to ask a question directly, if I may. Just if I might. I found the discussion that what you were mentioning about the dissemination of information, how you actually get the norms on the ground, particularly in the areas of an emergency. Just a question about how that was actually received and what sort of reactions the networks. Was it difficult to convince them to implement these normative frameworks, or did they want to go ahead with their existing, or was there panic? Thank you.
There was one event which was a real battle. So, these protective equipment are called PPE, personal protection equipment. And MSF had many of their staff who actually died from the thing. So they had a very, very personal of the whole organization of how it should be. And they had their views, and all the others had a different view. So in terms of setting the norms, there was a discussion, and they couldn't sort it out what norm should be there. So at the end, they did something, my colleagues, that we should never have done. They voted. Okay, they voted, and MSF was outnumbered. You know what happened the next day? They went public and came with a press release saying how much they disagreed. So the only thing we could do is come back, understand that indeed we didn't have evidence. You know, you can't do a randomized control trial with 2 types of protective equipment and see which one is useful. So we needed to go back and reach a consensus, and this was the basis of a norm.
Thank you. So now the microphone will be passed to Carsten Staur, Denmark's permanent representative to the United Nations. Thank you.
Yes, it is working. I will be using my very limited time just on migration. We're not talking refugees. That's an A2 next door, and a little bit later in the afternoon. But so this, what I say, will only pertain to the migration issue, of course. And also to say that migration traditionally, of course, is a key element in national sovereignty. Any country decides who to let into its territory, under which conditions, and so on. It's very classical. Of course, you have to abide by international human rights law, international humanitarian law, and so on. But the whole issue of regulation of migration is a national sovereignty issue traditionally. What we saw last year in Europe, of course, was then a huge influx of irregular migrants and irregular moves, 1 million coming to Greece within 2015. And that created the process that has been alluded to, the 19 September meeting, and the initiation of negotiation of a global compact on migration to be finalized by 2018. That, of course, is now very much in the beginning. We're starting to talk about modalities. I'll go a little bit further and try to see what could be the elements of that kind of a compact. And it's a little bit outside the box and without any kind of sounding board, basically. But the question is, can we find agreement on a political framework that will allow countries to start building on that framework in the way that they develop their own national policies? We'll still have national policies. We won't get a normative framework in the binding sense, but it could easily be some more soft indications on how to deal with it. And I would basically see 5 elements that, and most of these are already in the New York Declaration, but I think that would be the key elements of any kind of compact, if we are to agree to it. And if it is a big if, I think, right now. One of them is the whole issue of clearly acknowledging countries' right to control their territory, to guard their borders, to combat trafficking, smuggling, also to reject and to expel irregular migrants. That is something that you will find in the New York Declaration. The second point, also a reflection of international norms, is all countries have a legal obligation to take back or readmit their own nationals if they return, whether voluntarily or involuntarily. These are 2 strong points which are being pushed, of course, by a number of countries who want to have the hard form of control of migration. But you also, in that context, need to throw in a few other elements. One of them is the demographic aspect of a number of countries that will have to face the reality of a decrease in active population and working age population over time, over the next few years. And there will be a need for more legal migration, there's no doubt about it. The difficulty is to get that acknowledged and get that to be a political agenda issue, which it isn't right now. So that's the third element. The fourth element is, in the same manner that you can say that some countries will be facing a negative demographic challenge, others will be facing a positive demographic challenge. They would need, and that's where the 2030 agenda comes in very much, they would need to develop policies that would be conducive to economic growth to keep pace with population growth and beyond that. And they would also need to develop policies that will allow them to get firmer integrated into global economy, attract foreign direct investments and so on, fighting corruptions, as Stephen was pointing to, increasing political accountability and so on. But it will be about jobs, and jobs for these countries. And there, you can say from a national point of view, participation in migration schemes, as countries of origin, good use of remittances, circular migration arrangements, improved diaspora relations and so on, are actually fitting very well in that kind of arrangement. And then finally, the fifth element, which are more bordering on the normative aspect, is that we have an issue, we have a challenge in terms of all those that falls between the cracks of, let's say, refugees and migrants, to be very blunt here, and of course imperfect. But there's no doubt that we need to uphold the refugee definition and the refugee convention. This is a major part of international humanitarian law, and it reflects our common humanity. It's also very clear that there's no right to migrate. There's no right to move from one country to another on your own will, and that countries have the right to turn away people that they don't want to accept. But then we have a gray area in between, what in the New York Declaration is termed as migrants in vulnerable situations. You can also find others. People that do not really fit the refugee definition, but are also moving because they have a reason to do that. That can be persecution, not persecution, of course, but you have natural disasters, you have environmental degradation, international initiative, you have climate change, and you have a number of other issues that push people. So somehow we would need to deal with that, and that is where the New York Declaration calls for a state-led process on migrants in vulnerable situations, leading to non-binding guidelines. And that may be a way out of this. It will not be an easy sell, and it will not be easy to do, but it could be a process that we could initiate. I think those 5 building blocks could, in my view, be part of, or key parts of any kind of global compact. Intellectually, I think they make sense. We don't need legally binding instruments. We don't need treaties or legal obligations. But we do need a UN that can basically provide a platform, a home for these kind of negotiations and discussions, and that can promote cooperation, dialogue, making it easier for countries to understand the thinking of others, and to facilitate gradual change over time. And I think that kind of ongoing discussion, Thomas would mention kind of soft norms or behavioral norms and so on, is very much, I think, where the UN can offer a platform here. I'll end by quoting, I think it's Princeton University Press, who advertised there are many publications with the heading of Changing the Conversations That Change the World. And I think that's basically where we need to take the Global Compact on migration. If we can do that in the next 2 years, I think we'll have done a good job. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to pull out a couple of the points that really struck me, I'm wondering where with the populist sentiments that we are seeing now in the area of migration, there seems to be very much a lack of a conversation on the positive contribution that migrants really do make, and your emphasis on decreasing populations or the negative and the positive demographic challenges, I think having a discussion also of the real value and the migrants really do add to many societies. Also that group of migrants that do fall through the gap, not currently recognized as refugees, but who absolutely need to move from where they are. Thank you. We can pick up on that in the question and answer because we are running short on time. So finally, Professor Susanna Hecht. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to sort of use, I'm going to use a PowerPoint. I need to give you some graphical information, which if I sit and describe it, you won't know what I'm talking about exactly. So this is what's called the Great Acceleration, which is sort of after World War II, you get these sort of sharp uptakes in what we might call environmental externalities of various kinds, and also environmental uses of various kinds. So I'm not going to dwell on this. I'm sure you've seen these graphs a million times, but the point is maybe you haven't seen them across so many things. Now, some of these are handled through international norms, some are handled through local norms, but certainly global biodiversity, questions of wetlands, the problems of climate are handled a lot, and ocean ecosystems are handled through international norms, at least in one level. But of course, these are, as they say, where the pedal hits the metal, and so there's other things that go on. So what I'm going to do here is talk a little bit about something called the forest transition. So while we have these rising things, in many areas in Latin America where I work, what you have is a decline in deforestation and a lot of forest recovery. And all of that actually integrates quite well with the other themes that we've seen today. So what this does, of course, and particularly the stuff on climate and so on, is produce these Category 5 storms. This is, of course, Katrina. So just to make sure that everyone understands that the risk society is not just a third world thing, and that questions of climate justice are not merely the issues of flooding in Bangladesh, for example, or problems of the natural disasters in other areas that produce refugees. So it's important to realize also that these kinds of dynamics are going to undermine a lot of the sustainable development goals. So in a certain sense, all the other things in many ways kind of hinge on how well these questions are resolved. So I'm going to give you a positive story, not the usual declensionist thing, which people use to have you give them money. And there's plenty to be declensionist about, by the way. I mean, you know, I'm not completely happy about the state of the world. But one of the things that is actually rather interesting is that in spite of what you may be hearing, deforestation in Amazonia has, for example, dropped by 80% since 2014. Now, why did this happen? Well, part of it was global outrage about the implications of deforestation, also a continuing pressure from scientists, social organizations, civil society, social movements about the questions that were being raised through the UN framework on climate change. So even though you might have been sneering about those infinite COP meetings in places like Bali, and you're thinking, wait a minute, how come they get to go to Bali and everything? On the other hand, even those people who were going to Bali were having an impact on at least shaping the discourse in a profound way. Now, what happens with this? Part of it is that the states actually integrate into this, and they say, well, we're going to reduce our deforestation by X, and all deforestation is equal to the entire transportation system, so it's a really big thing to reduce this. And you also have local groups on the ground, you have environmental groups, you have business people, you have people analyzing commodity chains, you have many things going on at multiple scales saying, you know what, we're not going to buy stuff from the Amazon because it causes climate change and also has a lot of social injustice to it. And to go back to that other thing, there's a lot of climate injustice that comes from these dynamics. Another thing about this, and I'll show you a map in a moment, is that this was also attended by quite a bit of discussion about human rights, particularly the ILO, but also the questions raised in the framings of human rights by the UN. So one of the things is that this is multi-scalar, it's across societal elements, it works at also at multiple governments and governance levels. So it's a very interesting thing about looking at how such norms might be incarnated. And it's a serious thing. This is equivalent to taking 3 million cars off of the roads of the United States for 4 years. So that's not so bad. Try to do it some other way in terms of controlling emissions. And as I always like to say, trees have already been invented, so you don't have to wait for some technological change to fix it. This is some other work that I've done with people at JPL, and this is from, so Brazil's rich. You could sort of say, well, of course they, have all this, satellites and everything, and scientists all over the place. But this is El Salvador. And what you see here is a really interesting process. So we have control of deforestation on one hand, which is, and this is not, I could show you more slides, but I don't have time, from other countries where you sort of are seeing a similar dynamic. But one of the sort of lesser known dynamics is this thing called forest resurgence. And when we started documenting this in the early 2000s, I cannot tell you how much flack we got. But the point here is that in the post-war period, what you had was an extraordinary story of forest recovery from a place which had been described by most ecologists because of its population density as a site where nature had been destroyed. Now, why did we get this? Well, we got this from certain amounts of public policy. We had it, but one of the most key things was that this really reflects the use of remittances. So in a certain sense, remember that these wars had an extraordinary effect on putting lots of people out of their initial countries. You'd be surprised how many people in Latin America have had that experience. But anyway, so I'm getting the cowbell. So I'll just zoom on and say, these are remittance landscapes. This is another thing, again, you might think, oh, what a nice forest, what a nice natural forest. This really actually reflects market dynamics associated with that wonderful health augmenting drink called acai. So you can get even straightforward market things producing extraordinary amounts of forest recovery. So the point that I'm really going to end up with here is that this is the current conservation map of Amazonia. And what you see here is really a reflection of a lot of environmental norms and modification of those. Those orange things are indigenous reserves. They're sustainable development reserves all over the thing, and also which is basically making sure that people have rights to livelihood through their use of forest, and then finally also the questions of full conservation, and all of this actually is dramatically changing the climate dynamics in terms of its control of emissions compared to what it otherwise would be. That's it.
Thank you. So it's very interesting to see actually the use of remittances in the forest resurgence, and I never would have put those two together. We'll open it up questions from the floor. Now I'll take 4 questions and then we'll come back to the panelists. So we can start just down here. And if you can please introduce yourself and state your organization. Thank you.
Yep. I'm Dario Piselli with here at the Graduate Institute with the Sustainable Development Solutions Network as well. So we have, of course, discussed the role of the UN normative role in the 2030 agenda. But listening to the case studies, I think one interesting question would also be to see what the role of the 2030 agenda, and specifically the SDGs, is going to be in informing this normative role. And I'm referring specifically to the problem of interaction. Most of you have talked in your case studies about the need to take into considerations other aspects of the 2030 agenda when dealing with sectoral issues. And my question would be how the interaction that is contained in the SDGs in terms of the different integrated approaches that you have to take within goals and among goals is going to inform norm setting, for cross-sectoral norm setting, for example, within your respective organizations. Thank you.
Just next, and then we'll go over here.
Hi, my name is George Angiparidze. I'm with the International Air Transport Association, but I'm also quite familiar with the UN. I used to be at the UNFCCC, both at the Secretariat and as a negotiator, and before that with the World Bank. So my question is, we heard this morning quite a bit about the need to move the UN more into this implementation role. So I was wondering what that actually means. So is it about the UN as a monitor, as an evaluator? Is it about setting operational standards? Or is it really about sort of the implementation end of things? And the reason I ask this question is because when you think about efficient development partners and those that are effective at delivering the developmental assistance, it's not always that the UN agencies come up top. But they do have a role. So I guess my question to you is, how do you see that role? What does that mean to you in terms of the UN moving into an implementation role?
Cecile? Yeah.
Sorry, Cécile Molinier, I'm formerly with UNDP. My question will be addressed more specifically to Ms. Keeney about the Ebola experience. If I understood you correctly, you said that WHO essentially has 3 roles: norm setting, technical assistance, and emergency response. And I also understood you to say that maybe WHO should focus more on norm setting and possibly be less involved in emergency response. But I heard something that Bruce Cheng said in his introduction, that in order to remain relevant and effective, the UN system should integrate a lot more its normative and its operational role. And I would like to ask you, I mean, my point of view as somebody who's also worked a lot at country level, is what good are norms if they do not translate into, on the one hand, strengthening the capacity at country level and making countries better prepared to respond to emergencies, and on the other hand, if they do not translate into a better ability to respond to crisis. So focusing on the Ebola experience, maybe in retrospect, what lessons could you draw from that experience and what recommendations could you make so that WHO, but not only WHO, other UN agencies could better integrate their normative and operational roles? Thank you.
One final question over here, and then we'll come back. We'll come back to you in the second round. Sure. No, sorry, behind you. Yeah. So you please go ahead.
Oh, okay. Okay. Thank you very much. This is an open question for whomever wants to answer. My name is Adriana Ruiz Restrepo. I am Colombian. I worked in UNODC and in the Commission on the Legal Empowerment of the Poor, hosted by UNDP some years ago. Now I work in a consultancy think tank called RA. And what my question is precisely about corruption and the normative role. The case studies and the research and the information that we have is that there's capture of the normative language in the local level. So when you have a provision for protecting X, you start through lobbying, changing that X doesn't actually mean X, but kind of like Y, or some, and the interpretation of the norms in the local field, in the grassroots, is fundamental. So I would like to first stress the importance of norms when there's nothing else to defend. The concept protects you. The concept guides you. So norms are axiological and they're fundamental for organizing society. The question of implementation is a question of agency and capacity, and I think that the UN should work more in the bottom-up approach. And there you need whistleblowers, human rights defenders, real civil society, I mean not mercantile civil society, real citizen civil society, and to protect the language of the norms. I have enough cases to show that the law and the norms, the decrees, are being reinterpreted by multinationals needing the norm to say what the status quo had before. So I would like your reaction on that. Thank you.
And if you could just pass the microphone behind, we'll take the question on the private sector. Thanks.
So, I'm Stephanie Koutoukis. I spent the vast majority of my career in big pharma, so private sector. I'm here today just for out of personal interest. Now, my question clearly is related to the private sector, because a lot of people on stage talked about how the private sector should be made more accountable for implementing those norms. Now, I'm interested in what is it specifically that you would propose the private sector could do, and then how are you going, or how is the UN or any other organization going to be able to motivate the private sector to actually do that? Because my experience is that there's a tendency in the private sector to avoid norms or to exploit gray areas for competitive reasons. So I'd like to know, so what are the solutions that you're proposing to get to common results?
Okay, thank you. So we'll now return to the panelists. The first question with respect to the interactions of the different SDGs and how they the different SDGs affect the various areas of work. That is really for all the panelists to talk about the issue area. The next question is really about the UN agencies. So we'll start with the first question. If I can ask you just to please keep your comments to 1 minute, 2 minutes, so that we can take another round of questions. Thank you.
Thank you so much. In terms of the question about the interaction about the SDG and the norm setting, I personally believe that we're going to see much more cases where the SDG will also inform the need to adjust the norm. I said before that I don't believe that we need more new norms, but we may get to a situation where everybody is in need of, especially where the data is lacking today. Especially we are facing that in some of the labor-related indicators. Secondly, related to that, I also believe that the UN system, especially with the normative side, we may have also to revisit the existing norms. A lot of them may need to be updated, actually, to today's world and the SDGs. Then quickly, if I may use the issue about moving the UN into the implementation mode. This is the whole discussion about the fit for purpose. Clearly that the challenge for us, and somebody pointed out, is not only just for the UN, but all the international development working at the field level. How do we make sure that not only we move to implementation mode, but not focusing on we implementing, but we assisting the countries to develop the capacity to implement. The sustainability of the SDG will come to our ability to help the countries to implement instead of we implementing it, which is a big difference. Thirdly and lastly, third and fourth, the issue about the corruption and the norms, which is a very vivid, I've seen it in the case of Bangladesh, where you have the private sector, the owner of the factory, they're also a member of the parliament. So when you want to change the labor law, you have the private sector that they also have to vote. So there's a governance issue. I'm not necessarily implying that that is corruption, but there's clearly a good governance issue behind that, which we have been working positively with them, but it goes beyond Bangladesh, as I said at the beginning, so it's a very valid point. The private sector, I want to, again, I'm not naive. I know how the private sector sometimes can want to, circle the square or vice versa, etc. But let me also make a little bit the devil's advocate. More and more, the major multinationals, they know their reputation is at stake. So not because they are, they are best than we are, but for their own reputation, they more and more want to do business only with countries or local companies that are respecting the norms. The challenge is the fact that they might be better equipped than the country to measure those indicators that will conclude whether or not you are respecting the norm or not. So again, for me, is the ability of the countries to be able to dialogue or to negotiate with them. In the program, ILO program that I refer to as Better Work, what we are working is really working for international buyers in the government sector and helping the local companies to respect the norms, the labor standard, and when they respect it, they get more orders.
Taking the point about cross-sectoral work, I would just like to come to an example that I'm actually working with Gilbert and also with OECD on a theme which is health, employment, and economic growth. So for this, it deals with health, it deals with employment, it deals with education, and also the economy. And so we have to set up new norms for that, to see, if in order to have the health workers with the right education, there needs to be norms that can be harmonized across countries. This is the same for migration. There's a lot of migrant health workers. So what do we do so that their capacities are recognized from one country to another? And this is work which is a lot of norms. in terms of also trying to put back on the table how the migration of health workers can benefit the countries of origin, the countries of destination, and the health workers themselves, is also a question of norm that needs to be discussed. There was a missed opportunity a few years ago where the code of conduct for recruitment of health personnel was discussed, but this is a time that we cannot miss it. When the ambassador talked about the negative and the positive demographic dividend, we should have norms, so we don't come. I have a previous president in my country, France, who said, yes, we want l'immigration choisie, chosen immigration. We want only to take in the migrants who are well educated. So this cannot be without some norms, because otherwise all the well educated people move and the non-educated people stay. The same for health workers. So all this is needing norms in order for the countries to agree among themselves. Now, just a question on Ebola. I have not said that WHO should not move on emergency and should not strengthen its capacity to do emergency. On the contrary. But what I'm saying is that currently when governments, the high-income country, look at WHO, the only thing they see is emergency. And I think that this is too much, because of course WHO must have an emergency program which is effective and must respond to emergency. But we also do other things, and these other functions should not disappear just for the sake of being able of the work on emergencies. Thank you.
Thank you. Just to take up the last issue, I think it is incredibly important and it can be put in many, many different ways and more edge than others in political statements. But it is quite clear that there is a national sovereignty in deciding who is allowed into a country. There is an exception on terms of refugees, and we should safeguard that. But otherwise, a country decides itself. And if a country wants to initiate a migration scheme, it can do so, and it will itself choose who will come. That's a legal basis, and I don't think we can challenge that. But you can do a lot of things in order to make sure that you can have circular migration. You can have a lot of other pathways than you can have visas and different kinds and so on. There's a lot of leverage in a room to play with that. But the basis here I think is incredibly important. To maintain that. Otherwise, there would be no discussion. Could I just come back to what Gilbert was saying on the private sector, which I think was really important there. There is no doubt that the private sector will have a potential for a very important transformational role. John Rocky, a few weeks ago at the Forum for Business and Human Rights, made the point that 1 out of 6 workers in this world were employed in a global supply chain. So basically linking up somewhere to the issue of reputational risk, the issue of transnational corporations, and also then to the power of basically changing things down the supply chain. And I think that is really what we need to explore. 2 billion people, according to John Rocky, as workers or families or communities, have a direct link to global supply chain. So it's a really great and significant transformational force in the global economy that has been much underutilized. That would be my point here. On the SDGs and on the UN role, I was head of Geneva for 6 years, and I always said I didn't always say, but once in a while I thought that why is this so difficult? Because basically when we talk about development, we just need the right policies, strong institutions, and sufficient funding. So how difficult can it be? Of course, the devil is in the detail there. But if I look at the UN role and I link it to those elements, there's no doubt that the UN can provide a lot of advice when it comes to the right policies. There's no doubt that the UN can provide a lot of advice and a lot of technical assistance when it comes to capacity building, institutional development, getting the strong institutions, especially strong public institutions, which will have a key role in any country. But when it comes to sufficient funding, that's not a UN strong position. Bruce Jenks have made the calculations that the UN system as a whole, development, peacekeeping, whatever, is close to $50 billion a year, and that's a huge amount of money. But it's $1 out of each $1,500 that is going through the world economy every year that ends up somehow in the UN system. So it is a limited force, and I think so the UN should basically be looking to what the system does well, and it is policy advice, it's capacity building, institutional development, across a number of technical fields, across a number of other things that can allow countries to expand their political space, their financial space, in order to develop the right policies and get the right outcomes for citizens. I think that's where I do see the strong points of the UN. Thank you.
Thank you, Susanna.
Okay, I have a couple of things to say. One is that in terms of policy and capacity building, I think there's quite a bit to be learned from the UN framework on climate change, which was a much more dynamic process, I think, than most policy making is. Even though it has a kind of urgency to it, it was sort of responding to sort of what we might call slow motion events rather than crisis, but with a great deal of agility. And also the development of extraordinary capacity building and monitoring. Again, it wasn't done by the UN, but it was the ideas and the norms and moral suasion and the convening of the spaces for discussing this, the UN had an extraordinary role. In the question of supply chains, it's very important to realize that Carrefour, Walmart, suddenly decided, after getting yelled at and people boycotting their materials, even things like Nike and so on, began to sort of say, well, wait a minute, we're not going to buy products that have a deforestation footprint. And this actually was an important element in this, as consumer boycotts and business boycotts, perhaps not from the world's best reasons, but certainly were quite effective in changing the nature and the natures of the supply chain, which had an impact on that deforestation dynamic. The other thing was the question, and of course, hanging over all of this is the question of climate change. The other thing is that if you look at things, to get to this person's question about what does business do, well, there are things like the soy moratorium and so on, which brought together various, I hate the term stakeholders, but people with interest in this process. And many of them were large soy producers. So there's quite a bit of capacity, I think, that's you can see reflected in land use.
Thank you. Sorry to cut that out. We would like to take a second round of questions because we do have many interesting people in the audience as well. So please raise your hand high so that I can see you. We have one question over here. The gentleman. We can start here and then we can go behind. Yep.
Thank you. Name's Richard Golding. I'm an independent consultant, long time in the private sector. It's really a follow-on, if I may push it further, to this private sector discussion we've just been having. And that is, do the three agencies represented here, or do the panelists feel the UN system as a whole, does enough in terms of selling the problem? Whether it's existing norms and the problem of compliance and the problem of raising standards and so on, or whether it's with new norms as a result of new policy decisions to tackle new issues. Does the UN system, or do any of these UN agencies, do enough to estimate what the cost is of filling that capacity gap, and then what the ongoing cost is of monitoring and evaluation and so on? Because these things cost serious amounts of money. And selling that and incentivizing the private sector and indeed other sectors to get involved and view these issues. And I think the Bangladesh one is potentially an interesting one that I'm being let me use a simplistic example. For example, 5 years of co-investment into raising construction standards or labor standards in a country like Bangladesh may yield 25 years of supply chain investment, relatively reputation-free or with minimal reputation as a result. I think there's some imaginative thinking going on there. Do you think the UN agencies that you represent are doing enough in terms of that thinking, and could they do more?
Thank you. The question behind here. In the middle of the room toward, yeah.
Thanks very much. My name is Charles Gore. I used to work in UNCTAD, particularly on least developed countries. We've been hearing that there's a problem of implementation and we don't need more norms. I'd like to ask the panel if those issues are related. Is the weak implementation of norms related to the design, the existing design of the norms? And secondly, if you were to give advice to a norm entrepreneur who wanted to introduce new universal norms in any field, which were easily implementable, do you have any advice to give them? What would be your advice?
Thank you. Any other questions? We have one question over here. Esther, do you mind bringing them? Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Shireen Lindsay Hurst from the Institute for Media and Global Governance. I would like to address my question to His Excellency Gilbert Humbo and Ambassador Carsten Stohr regarding migration. Could you possibly offer some reflection on the link between national sovereignty and the rise of the populist movement across Europe? How would you expect to balance this trend with the rights of refugees and migrants within the established and international framework of norms? Thank you.
So we might go back to the panelists now. Questions, just to answer the questions on is the UN doing enough? Implementation, and this final question related to migration. So Gilbert, would you like to begin? Is the UN doing enough, given the resources that it has?
That's quite a very easy question, thank you. No, the UN is not doing enough. Let's be very clear. I don't know how I can sit here as an international civil servant and say that, oh, we're doing everything we could. No. And I've also have the opportunity to be on the other side and serve in the government. And I can tell you that the UN, there's a lot of room for improvement. The challenge, most of you have heard the new Secretary General talking about the challenge ahead of us. But again, I want to avoid the debate to become a debate of the UN is lousy, the UN is this. And I want to insist, the ultimate solution is building the national capacity to address the issue. It's really how do we refocus in our energy to help the countries to build their own capacity. When Marie-Paul talked about the Ebola case, that's again, when you think about it, at the end of the day, what's the capacity of the country to handle crisis and to implement the norms and so forth. Second question in terms of the if the issue for implementation, is it due to the fact that maybe the norm itself may have been ill-designed? It is possible. It depends on the norms. On one hand, from what I said, it's important that we uphold the principle of defending the norms. Quite frankly, otherwise we will fail. On the flip side, whether it's ill-designed or not, once you ratify it, you have to implement it. That's my point. Once it's ratified, then we also have to do everything to implement. And when you are facing problem in implementation, That's where I believe we have a lot of room to do, and ILO is really also, and I'm sure other colleagues as well. So my point is that the issue about implementation, we should not, I don't want to use the excuse of possible ill design of the norm to justify the implementation challenge. And some of it, and it's touched on by the first panelists, some of the issue, let's face it, is technical capacity, but also financial capacity. When I was talking about Bangladesh linking to the private sector, when you have the crisis, one of the equipment to inspect the building, only one equipment which was given by a private sector company, London-based, I don't want to mention the name. So the country doesn't even have the ability to purchase that equipment. So you do have a serious, I prefer 75% implementation of ill-design norm than using that excuse and doing nothing at all. My last point quickly in terms of the issue about the national sovereignty and toward the populism and the migration, and we are very clear by saying that we talk about migration here, not the refugee. I do believe that it is a collective responsibility, both from the sending, the transit, and the country of destination. And in that process, it's important that we keep eyes on respecting the norms, not only the norms in relation with migration per se, but for us, is when you have to deal with those massive migration, very quickly you have issue of child labor, you have issue of modern slavery, issue about, we are seeing it recently in Syria, Lebanon, and Jordan, and the issue about possibly paying people below the minimum wage. So we need to really keep an eye on this, but it has to be an issue of both sides, the three types: origin, transit, and country of destination.
I will take 2 points. One about, are we selling our norms again? And the other one, are there new norms needed? So it's difficult to sell norms. You know, do people understand what it is? It seems to be a constraint for the private sector, for example, who would like to sort of cut corner. It's, you know, when you look at our good friends from Gavi of the Global Fund, for example, so what they can sell very well, and we are happy with that, is the number of children saved, the number of people under antiretroviral treatment. But on this, for example, why do we have so many people on antiretroviral treatments thanks to Global Fund? It's because they can purchase generic drugs which are made out of India because the UN and WHO in this case is guaranteeing the quality of this. If not, then it wouldn't be the same number of millions. It would be only 10% of those. So, but this is not recognized. It's only the fact that the people are under retroviral therapy because the Global Fund buys the drugs, but how they can buy it, this is something that doesn't sell. So in terms of new norms, are they needed? I think in certain areas, certainly the evidence changes, and therefore you need to change the norms. We have had a complete rehaul of our norms on treatment of HIV, for example, because the drugs have changed, because there are no potential preventing treatment with drugs. So you cannot just say you've put your norms there and this is it. When the evidence changes, you must change the norms. Another one very recently, we just issued norms, and I was surprised myself, saying that when you go for surgery, you should use antibiotics before and during, but not after. What do? We use antibiotics all the time. It's important to change the norms when new evidence come forward.
Thank you very much. I think focus in on the issue on migration. I think that we last year, and I think we have to realize that in many European countries there was a real difficult situation in terms of what you can call a breakdown of controls, breakdown of border control, a breakdown of external borders, We had situations where a lot of people just moved from one country to another without basically not knowing where they were, who they were. And the whole issue, of course, was linked into the Syrian situation, the whole issue of security, of ISIL warriors and terrorists and so on, in a very difficult combination. And that kind of loss of control is not really well suited to a modern European society. We saw the same with the Ebola scare. Even though it was very, very far from Europe and not a real challenge, it created that kind of scare. And we see the same with a terrorist attack. It signals that there is not a governmental control of security in a country. And that is difficult, and it takes time to overcome that. And I think for me, that's something that we need to factor in when we move into a global compact. What I said is that I think we can find a platform which will allow us to align different approaches between various interests, and we will eventually, I think, be able to, if we can find a political solution to this, the implementation will be a national policy, it will be in bilateral agreements and so on, not in multilateral instruments, but it will be the possibility, I think, to do that. It'll take time, and we start from below zero. That's my point here. Thank you.
Susanna, I'll ask you to be very quick for our
yes,
next
I'm
panel
going
as well.
to be extraordinarily quick. I'm not going to talk about climate change, even though, of course, my heart would like me to. But I actually would like to raise the question of remittances, because not just because they're useful in terms of local investments, but because, first of all, these capital flows are huge. They're close to 700 billion a year. In many countries, you could not have any safety net without this. I should mention that one of the policies of our recent president-elect is to control the flow of remittances from migrants in the United States to their home countries. This would really be quite, given the kind of dependence on remittances that you see globally, this would be, and particularly in Latin America, this would trigger a great deal of instability that perhaps one had been rather relaxed about how relatively calm the place had been for the last couple of decades, but this would certainly enhance increased local conflict and civil conflict.
Thank you. Thank you to everybody who made comments from the floor. Thank you to all of our panelists. Clearly the normative framework in all of these issue areas is there, largely there. There are some gaps still, but it's questions of implementation of where does the UN's role, where does the UN pass the baton on to other actors, to business actors, to governments, etc., and questions of resources and capacity. So please join me in thanking the panelists. Thank you very much.
So they can see you. I can hide over here. Oh, okay. Okay, greetings. I would actually just like to immediately, so we don't waste any time, turn this over to Michael Muller, the Director of the United Nations Office in Geneva. I'd like to thank him sincerely for finding the time. He's actually flying off, what is it, in an hour or two? So he still managed to find the time to come. And then we'll kind of link up to the discussion as we move forward. Michael, over to you.
Thank you, Bruce, and good afternoon, all of you. I've just been briefed briefly by Bruce about the very fruitful discussion we've had so far on the UN's normative role, and I'm grateful that I can add a few reflections from my side. Let Let me first thank the Institute and the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation for organizing this seminar, which provides a really important and welcome opportunity for reflection in times of wide-ranging disregard of or questioning of the norms that have guided the international community for so many years. Norms helps us to develop a shared understanding of how we expect ourselves and others to behave. However, at a time of increased empowerment of the individual and a more general fragmentation of power at a global level, many of the agreed norms and rules are being challenged increasingly. Scrutiny is healthy and democratic, but it becomes problematic when the questioning turns into blind rejection without offering constructive alternatives. And examples of blatant disregard for certain norms and rules can be seen at all levels, from the local to the international, from domestic populism to the breaking of humanitarian law in conflicts worldwide. In some cases, the rule breaking may be selfish calculation, but in others, it's based on our collective failure to explain the norms and rules in a way that makes people understand why norms exist and how they benefit each and every individual on this planet. Here in Geneva, international Geneva, we generate extremely important norms and regulations that have direct impact on the lives of everybody. Many of the world's leading norm-setting organizations are concentrated here and have forged a unique ecosystem of expertise and operational capacity. The Human Rights Council, for example, defines and monitors norms to protect basic freedoms and rights worldwide. Similarly, in the domain of trade and intellectual property rights, UN entities in Geneva are making major contributions. Individual freedoms of free trade cannot be achieved without agreement on shared rules and norms to avoid discrimination. At today's seminar, you've heard a colleague from the ILO, whose labor standards improve working conditions worldwide, and you've heard from a representative of the WHO, whose health guidelines have saved countless of lives. The UN Economic Commission for Europe is one of the other key standard-setting organizations in Geneva with global impact on issues such as transport, road safety, vehicle regulations, trade facilitation standards, agricultural standards, etc. And even outside the UN system here, our partners in Geneva are active in this domain. The International Organization for Standardization is perhaps the clearest example of that, having published more than 21,000 international standards and related documents covering almost every industry, from technology to food safety to agriculture and healthcare. Looking ahead, a key priority in view of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development is to ensure that the norms and standards that are being defined here in Geneva, the technical and operational hub of the international system, reinforce the 17 Sustainable Development Goals. And we need to make sure that planning for implementation of those take both existing and new norms into consideration to adjust quickly to the rapidly changing environment and challenges facing us. This requires a high level of coordination, much more than we're used to. And there's a lot of potential for collaboration here. Non-state actors, including the private sector, have increasingly taken responsibility to set up their own normative frameworks. Food security, for example, organic foods. And it's really crucial to ensure that these frameworks do not compete, but are part of an integrated approach under the 2030 Agenda. We being the UN, need to become much better at involving all local stakeholders in the implementation and monitoring of adherence to international norms, beyond existing support through advice and capacity building. A rule that is imposed from the outside is rarely, if ever, as effective as one that people have internalized. And the 2030 Agenda can only be achieved if a much wider cross-section society, from government agencies to NGOs, academia and the private sector, internalize the norms on which we need to rely in implementing that agenda. All actors need to be on the same page, and global norms help to establish guidelines. To facilitate the cascading down of norms from the conference halls of Geneva to the street corners in our member states, a perception change project, which we started 2.5 years ago here in Geneva, is working on innovative ways to communicate about decisions taken here and beyond, and their implications on the ground. And we are also exploring ways of ensuring that bottom-up communication can be facilitated, including through social media. People need to be able to tell us what they think. We need such feedback so that the international community can ensure that the norms that we develop actually address the needs. Norms need to be flexible enough to accommodate change, while be strong enough to persist in spite of challenges. And this is a delicate balance where, in particular, the UN, but also other international organizations, have a very important role to play. It's crucial that we stop the trend of global norms being increasingly perceived as rules designed to favor the few and disadvantage the masses. Norms should not be limited to expected behavior. They have to be perceived as desirable again. And here in Geneva, we have a rich ecosystem full of positive examples that we must use to better explain the direct and beneficial impact of crucial norms on every individual. And we all have a role to play in making this happen. So I will stop here by thanking you once again for having convened this important seminar here in Geneva and for connecting New York and Geneva on such a crucial topic. And I hope that today's discussion has generated some concrete ideas and actions for how we can move forward to strengthen our normative role. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. I think the way we're going to try and proceed here, I want to make just a couple of very brief remarks that kind of try and connect a little bit what the Director General just said and the discussion that we've just had, 2 minutes at most. But fortunately, there's nobody with a cowbell now, so I'm loose. And then I'd like to open it up for discussion. I'm going to mention to you right now that the question I'd really like to focus on, and it's one which you've also really stressed, is what can the UN system concretely do to enhance its normative function? So it's kind of trying to pull this stuff together in terms of some very concrete ideas about where we should be going. Now, and then I will also ask the panelists if they'd like to contribute, and of course, we're going to come back to you and any time that you want to intervene. My very brief comments relate to some of the kind of trade-offs that have been discussed. We had a discussion around whether we need to be focused on kind of new norms or norm building, or whether we need to be focused on the implementation of norms. We had the definition early on between behavioral and technical norms, and that gave rise to certain discussion. We had a very, I thought, elegant and passionate statement by Gilles about the blatant disregard of some of the most important core norms that we stand for. We also had a presentation of different ways of creating the space to develop new norms, which was basically the John Ruggie experience with human rights principles. I thought that Gilbert made a very important point when he stressed at the very beginning that the norms, without the norms, you can't move forward. The norms is the foundation for action in that sense. And then he also said, and it's also something which Michael referred to, which was this idea that it's really important to be able to adjust and go with the times and make the changes, but then you have to be very careful about what it is that you're giving up and what it is that you're gaining. I'd like to link that back to actually some of the very early remarks that I made about a changing world. I think that, I don't think we can really, I think it's important, I'm trying to put it positively, I think it's important for the discussion to be based on a changing world where norms are being contested and where we need to figure out what to do with that situation, which is neither creating a new norm nor implementing an existing norm. It's actually struggling, it's a constant struggle to redefine the norms that we have and that we are working with, because they're under constant change, because they're new configurations, whether it's private sector, whether it's emerging powers or whatever. So I just wanted to kind of add that into the mix. So having said that, let's take a couple of comments, questions. If we could start with the audience, and then if we could come back to the panelists. Who would like to share their thoughts, in particular, hopefully with some concrete thoughts. Yes, please.
Thank you. I'm Sarah Sekenes from UNDP, and I want to start by thanking the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation and the Institute for holding this very stimulating event. I just wanted to mention a couple of concrete measures that are taking place. First of all, giving some reason of doubt to countries. Collectively, country teams have received 112 requests for support in implementing the 2030 agenda. And issues that are raised by countries are, for example, what has been mentioned here, I think, landing the agenda, aligning it to the national policies and national development plans. Here, one thing that has been stressed by many countries is also how to combine, simply because development has on one hand been dealt with separate from climate, but how you lift that into the development plans. So that's one thing that they're asking for support in terms of making sure that these are addressed in a joint fashion. Another thing on data and measurement, not so much perhaps in terms of what was mentioned earlier in some global comparison, but rather to ensure that their own policies and the budget allocations actually are directed the right way in giving results. And for that, they need measurements. They need data to understand if and when the policies work. And perhaps also make a comment here on an additional element of the narrative around the 2030 agenda, that it should leave no one behind and it should reach those furthest behind first, which I think also expresses some of the importance of Goal 16, that perhaps carries some of the more behavioral norms, if you wish, to put a face on those who are furthest behind, to understand the policies that would actually give the highest impact on those furthest behind. A third thing they're asking for is the issue of acceleration. To what extent do you look at the trade-offs and see where can you get the biggest win across the board of goals without jeopardizing the sustainability of the entire agenda? And the fourth element that they ask for is policy support in general, but also what is the most optimal architecture of how you coordinate domestically the implementation of the agenda. Who's in charge and who should then coordinate across ministerial kind of whole of government approach, and beyond that whole of society approach to be more inclusive. So those are just a few things. And just parallel to that, member states have indeed asked the United Nations Development Group to develop mainstream reference guidance. So that's being done, collectively chaired by UNDP as the chair of the UNDG, in terms of coming up with guidance for implementation of the agenda. So there's some concrete elements.
Great, thank you. That's very helpful. In the back over here.
Thank you very much. Defne Gönenç, I'm a PhD student at the Institute. A concrete thought. Well, we have sanctions, but sanctions are posed on states. But how about imposing transnational sanctions at a company level? How would you elaborate on that? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to get one of the panelists to deal with that one. Virginia, you wanted to...
We were asked here to say something about challenges and opportunities. And I think that in the areas where I work, there are three major challenges and opportunities. One of them is there are knowledge management, partnerships, and what I would call solution uptake. In knowledge management, in today's world, you see more and more, we are becoming more and more aware of the interrelationships. For example, we mentioned the interrelationship between labor standards and construction standards. There are interrelationships between health and economy and employment. And these interrelationships, we need to identify them. We need to identify who in the private sector, who in the UN. Often inside of the UN, we don't know what's being done in different sectors that have a relationship with the sector where we're working. So there's a challenge and there's an opportunity for the UN in knowledge management. Then in partnerships, partnerships in a multidimensional world where you have interrelationships between these different sectors and between the work in different organizations in the UN are extremely important for effectiveness. But our organizations, our budgets, and our accountability inside of the UN are all based on silos. You cannot even report that you have a joint activity. You have to report it as two separate activities, one under this organization and one under another. And so we're missing the incentives and the encouragement to even, we can't even identify and measure the partnerships that we have so that we can encourage the UN staff to deepen those relationships and their effectiveness. So I think partnerships is another challenge and another opportunity for us inside of the UN. And then the third area that I wanted to mention is what I'm calling solution uptake, not to call it innovation dispersion, which is a more technical issue, but when we have identified solutions, be they technical solutions to things like clean water, or be they solutions like how to get movements in society that raise consciousness about violence against women. These solutions, how do we get them more widely taken up? How do we develop the frameworks to have these innovations or these solutions taken up on a wider scale? Because if you have a solution to a problem and you do pilot projects in 3 villages in Sudan or 10 villages in India, that's a long way from implementing it across the board. We have to look at how to develop the incentives and the systems to see the solutions that we find in the UN taken up more widely. Thank you.
Great questions. Let me take the one in the back there. Yeah, let me just say I'm going to do a very, very un-UN-like thing. That's because I've been retired for 7 years, so I'm beginning to lose the DNA. I'm going to ask Gilbert afterwards. Yes, he is Deputy Director General of the ILO, but he was also Prime Minister of his country for 4 years. I would love to invite you to make some comments as a Prime Minister. This whole norm discussion, how did you use it? And I know you have some very interesting thoughts on that, so it's not totally unfair. You'll think it's totally unfair, but it's not. Please, over there. And then, I'm going to, I think that a lot of the issues that Virginia raised, the partnership, the knowledge management, they're actually very close to Michael's heart, so I'm also going to ask him to respond to that.
My question is, we have been discussing the norm, modify the norm, or taking the new challenge. And I'm in favor of maintaining the norm, but taking the challenge too. Because, for example, the Ebola, if WMO or WHO is not taking the lead, who is going to take the lead? The second is the climate. This is that 10, 20 years ago, it's not an issue. But then if the UN didn't invest in taking the lead, then who will do the lead now? It's changing. So we have to foresee what is the future problems and actively involved. Thank you.
Thank you. Those are good points. Gilbert, are you ready?
Thank you.
He doesn't mean thank you, but never mind.
I think you're right. What I'm going to say, what we said is a Chatham House rule. It's very clear that viewed from a different angle, I will put that in maybe 3 or 4 categories. You do have, first of all, you ask yourself, what are all the norms, all sectors put together that I have to comply with? And sometimes you don't even know all of them, including those that you may have ratified 30 years ago. Secondly, there are some norms which I call public goods that at the national level, the country, be it low or middle or high income country, may not be interested to implement them. If you take, for example, ILO Convention on Domestic Workers, you see have a lot of Western countries that have not ratified that convention. So the international system, the UN system, has to be the one pushing, become kind of the repository or the guardian of pushing for the implementation or ratification and implementation of those norms that at the national level, maybe there's not that much incentive to move ahead. The third category, real politics. You have some of those norms. You don't want to be, the name and shame game. And countries might ratify some norms not because they believe in them, just because they don't want to be on the list of those countries that have not ratified them. So it's obvious that when you take those categories, you will have norms that are ratified, but the implementation will suffer. That goes back to a question that was asked before in terms of ill design or not, because we also know how the process of adoption of the norms, how it goes. And then there's a fourth category, which I believe is a lot, comes back to that. That's why I was insisting in the UN role in technical assistance to implementing those norms. A lot comes down to that. Then you have, and somebody also raised that question in terms of the contradiction, possible contradictory priorities. And you know very well, if I take, and I want to preface by saying that ILO does not have a position on that. ILO office does not have a position on that. ILO organization is a different story. The whole debate, which essentially is WTO, whether or not you should have the labor law convention embedded in trade agreement, obviously is a very hot potato, which you really, at the end, countries at the national level or sub-regional level have to look at their interests. And it will go one way or the other, realpolitik oblige. So this step also, I felt sometimes that we, from the UN perspective, we underestimate that dimension. The last category is the short-term versus long-term. When you are facing challenges, difficulties, like let's take the case of the massive refugee in Syria right now, or not Syria, but Jordan, Lebanon, and Turkey, etc. The temptation, if the law says that the minimum wage is $10 an hour, let's say, the temptation is that if by giving $7 an hour, you can double the number of jobs created, you might be tempted. But this is where the problem starts. You might think that you are solving short-term problem just to find out that after 2 years, that minimum wage is now down to $2. And then modern slavery has started. So during the crisis, or when you are moving the transition phase, early recovery, how do we make sure that you really uphold the standard? That's where, and quite frankly, being from the UN, I really admire the work that the humanitarian side of the UN does in those circumstances. That's where we really need to uphold the standard there, despite what at the national level, the feedback you might have. My last point is the fact that we also need to be very mindful that sometimes we can all agree on the need to have this norm, but the priority of the implementation can vary from one region to another. Let me give you a very concrete case. We just finished 9/11 2012, not 2001. 9/11 2012, we have a big fire incident in a factory in Pakistan. So it took 4 years to try to come with an agreement in terms of compensation. And the private sector, by the way, from Germany company, was very, very, very effective, wanted to solve the problem. at least because of reputational risk. And we did it according to ILO Convention 121. You know, at the beginning I said 141, so I'm correcting that. It's Convention 121, which really give you the processes. So now this provide for payment that are going to go through many years. Then after we finish that, which was done according to the convention, then we have a demonstration locally by the beneficiary, because they don't want the long-term payment, they want lump sum payment now. And our suspicion, our worry, at least if you have the short-term payment now, you're going to have a risk of corruption that one was raised also before. So my point here is that sometimes the priority in terms of how we need to understand that, you know, we can all agree on the norm, but it can be much more urgent to be implemented in one setting different than another setting, and this is not easy. I'm sorry I was a bit long, but you gave me the chance.
Not at all, thank you. That's really interesting. We're going to have to wrap up pretty soon. Are there any, I'd like to take another comment, or if there is one, but very, very brief. Please, very, very brief, and then I'm going to turn it over to Michael.
Yeah, thank you. Briefly and clearly, implementing Agenda 2013 and enhancing normative, it's linked with the UN reform process, which is still going on. Yes, we got Council, Human Rights Council, not anymore Commission. Another reform process are still going on, WTO, dispute settlement, a governing body, ILO governing body, Security Council. Thank you.
As you said, that was very short and to the point. Great stuff, thank you. Michael, would you like to make some comments?
Yes. I love optimists. I'll get back to you in a moment. First of all, thank you to our colleague from UNDP for starting us off and giving us a framework within which many of the other questions sort of find their natural resting place. Because really, whether we talk about norms or implementation of any way we try to describe what we're going to have to do over the next decades, it's all within that envelope. And it's both a challenge, but it also has made everybody's life a lot easier because we're all on the same page. Let me briefly try to answer the question about sanctions. It's already happened, has been happening for years that the companies are being sanctioned, but particularly in the peace and security environment. But I think that as we move into, we are moving now into very different governance structures, also within the demands of what the implementation of the SDGs are asking of us. And we are moving into sort of multi-stakeholder arrangements, polycentric arrangement, whatever you want to call it. Clearly, companies of all sorts are going to be an important part of the process, the decision-making process, the negotiating process, and also the process of accountability. And one would imagine, and I'm guessing now, that you will be seeing over the next few years examples of where, as the norms that we create, the new ones and the new rules that we create are beginning to gel, and we figure out ways of making sure that everybody's on the same page, that those who are not, and are not willfully or in a criminal way and in other ways, that there will be also an evolution of the ways that we are going to hold people, actors, to account of how we collectively are going to be implementing these norms. Virginia, I'm completely with you, but to me, there's a very clear red thread through all these other three things: knowledge management, partnership, innovation. In a sense, there are three sides of the same pyramid, and very much at the heart of what we need to do in order to get where we all agree we have to go. I think it's happening already, particularly here in Geneva. This understanding instinctively and organically that we need to break down those silos, that we need to work much more in an integrated way across issues, across different organizations. The problem is it's not happening fast enough. Developments are moving really, really quick, whether they're developments on the substance, whether they're developments in the technological sphere, and our structures are simply genetically incapable of really moving at the speed that is needed right now. But it's possible, but it's going to be the major challenge, or one of the major challenges of the new Secretary General, to give the impetus and the leadership to basically do a seriously existential change. The way I normally put it, just to people who don't know the UN, is that for the past 70 years we've been telling our staff, and we have been rewarding our staff for hoarding information and for working in silos. And all of a sudden, one fine morning, we wake them up and we tell them, guys, from now, you will be rewarded and held to account for sharing information and for working across issues and across organizations. It's a complete flip-flop for bureaucrats that don't like change. It's a real challenge. And it's a challenge that goes across the whole organization and our partners, and indeed in every single capital, because we are a mirror image of our member states. Ministries are siloed, etc. So it's really a tall order, but one that we have to tackle, because if we don't, we're not going to get there. But it is happening. I mean, I'll give you a quick example. I mean, several examples here. Very spontaneously, over 30 organizations have gotten together totally informally at fairly senior level to sit down and discuss how they together will implement the SDGs and how we can work out ways of doing so. I mentioned the Perception Change Project recently that we started 2.5 years ago. Through that, one of the side effects of that is also new synergies, new collaborations, new understandings that in doing so, you actually leverage and maximize the impact of your own projects by doing it together. So organically it's happening a little slow. And we need to find imaginative ways of pushing it. One of the things that I'm doing now, which I think is going to be helpful, is the creation of a unit that we call the SDG Lab, which is going to be a kind of a resource center, the glue for all the stakeholders here, not just UN, but everybody, business, NGOs, civil society, partner organizations, where we will help them share information, share best practices, avoid overlap and duplication, increase and maintain a fluid conversation with other parts of the world that are involved in the implementation of these goals, be a resource center for colleagues from member states who come through here who need help with identifying the best solutions for some of the implementation of their priorities. A learning center. I'm encouraging a lot of countries, particularly those who will need more help than others in the implementation, to send young colleagues from line ministries who never get out of the country normally to come and be exposed, spend a couple of weeks, a month, or whatever in this unit to learn and to be exposed to the way that the international community is helping them with that, and what kind of resources are available for them. Anyway, it's a very flexible, open. So we are coming up with new tools to try and break that problem, which is a major one and has been for the last 70 years. Thank you.
Great, thank you very much. Well, on my part, just a couple of very brief words before turning it over to the final with Thomas and Henrik. Firstly, I'd just like to say I think it's... Sorry?
Sorry, I forgot the link to reform.
Go ahead.
Just very quickly.
That's okay.
No, clearly, of course, you're right. That it goes hand in hand. And I was just talking about the reform of the bureaucracy and the structures, the way we work. We're not going to get a structural reform any day soon. There's simply not the political will to do so. So we have to figure out ourselves, with our partners, a way around it by doing it the way I described it, that finding much better ways to work together, to collaborate, to integrate our work, etc. If there are two places in the UN system that need reform, also because, and we haven't talked about that, but the really sort of overarching problem that we have, all of us, whether it's the UN system, governments, other institutions, is the massive trust deficit that we are operating under right now. People simply don't trust us anymore. And we need to capture that back if we are going to be effective in helping member states and communities implement those goals that we have all agreed to. We somehow have to find a way to get the trust back. And the only way to do that is to prove that we're effective and that we help them. So you know, the incentive comes from different parts. But there are two places that, if we can, and here I'm sharing the wishful thinking that you expressed for a moment ago, there are two things for us and for the system. One is the Security Council, clearly, because it is the most symbolic structure of the system for everybody, and it's the one that most people base their perception, a negative perception about the system on, because it doesn't work. And the second one is the financial machinery, the engine room of the system, that is also not functioning the way it should. If you somehow manage to convince member states to really take a hard look at those and come up with some really innovative solutions that are not solutions like the last 25 years discussion has been, that are proposals for reform which are based in the past, in the way we did it, but something that really is innovative and that will manage to deal with the new challenges in the way that our intellectual understanding of the complexity of problems is today, then maybe we'll get somewhere. Sorry.
No, not at all. I'm full of admiration for clearly a gene that you have, which I don't have, which is your automatic reaction is that you have an accountability and an obligation to answer a question, whereas I'm always looking to duck it. So I'm jealous. So let me just very briefly say that I think it's been a really great discussion. I hope you share that thought. I think it's covered, we've really covered a lot of ground, and there's been quite a lot of creative and thinking about some of these issues. I would just like to say that, as Michael said, as Henrik emphasized at the very beginning, we don't want this to be a one-stop, one end-of-stop meeting. I think the question, and we really welcome any input from you, any thoughts from you, the question is, how do we generate a strategic kind of thinking reform process around what are the elements that are required to strengthening the positioning of the UN generally on the issue of norms. With a changing world, there seems to be an incredible opportunity. I would even dare to say a once-in-a-generation opportunity to get some ground. I mean, not in a parochial way, but in a serious, substantive way. And that would require, at the most senior levels and elsewhere, for some really consolidated strategic thinking to take place to figure out how some of this comes together. I think the nature of the discussion we've had this afternoon demonstrates the need for that, because there's so many different trade-offs that you could possibly make. So I would just end it at that. And I'd like to thank everybody, but my job is actually not to do the thanking. That's the job of Thomas and Henrik. So thank you very much, and I hand it over to you.
Henrik first, I think. All right, you want me to start? Thank you very much. Sorry, not to repeat everything that has been said, but we have indeed covered and identified many important issues. But even if there were many challenges, I think there were actually more opportunities than proposals for action. So this is complex, it's political, but it's also very urgent. Just a few things that I can't but help to reflect upon. The first one is actually the whole Geneva perspective and recognizing and utilizing this extraordinary normative hub that Geneva is. So there's been very many smart and very inspiring stories, comments and ideas, and it's clear that this is an area of increased attention. And it's very useful to learn. I think some of the panelists has really contributed with really important messages. Things actually do work. I think the whole examples around the environmental norms really prove that point. But the trends and the context, the whole erosion of norms, and the sense of urgency that's also been conveyed is another thing that I would like to pick up on. And this negative trend really exists, and it's also accelerating. We're losing hard-won gains of several well-established norms, and increasing challenges and abuse of normative frameworks. I've said it in the introduction, but nationalism, protectionism, and populism this really calls for more, not less, refocusing of multilateralism. We also need to reassess poverty in one way, addressing pockets of poverty in middle-income countries, and not only service delivery in LDCs. And I think that's also something that comes out of what we've heard. But we also need to keep that focus on conflict-affected countries. The whole conceptual understanding, complexity and proliferation was also named regarding norm. The types of norms, the trade-off, support for normative implementation, defining responsibilities was raised here at the very end, but we also heard about tools for implementation, importance of communication, how new instruments and also financing, this must be, the instruments for financing needs to be redesigned to optimize implementation and monitoring of norms. I could go on. There's also an interesting issue around inclusivity related to the agenda, setting the agenda of monitoring and implementation of norms. Accountability, policy coherence. A lot of these things actually, cause me to think that there's a need to return, sort of back to basics, ensuring that the normative agenda is brought back to the very, very core and also, core of the UN's work, but also sort of reinventing the charter, if you like. Much of this is at the very, very core of the charter. And as Dag Hammarskjöld famously said, we might fail the charter, but the charter won't fail us. And if there is one thing that Bruce, you already did this, you always do that, you always steal my sort of ways of summarizing. But on the specific theme for this conference, the agenda, the 2030 agenda, of course, there's one thing that we can summarize this whole conference with, and I'd like to quote you again, Your Excellency Gilbert Ongbou. The main message: we will not reach the goals if we continue to underestimate the normative agenda. To me, that's enough of sort of recognizing the need for us to also continue to be involved with this. So a way of thanking both participants and the Geneva Graduate Institute is handing over this really fresh from the prints. It's a new biography of Dag Hammarskjöld. So Thomas, I'll give you your copy. But Michael, as you're traveling, perhaps something to read on the plane. Thank you very much. And.
Mindful of the fact that Michael is traveling soon, I'll just make a few concluding observations, wrapping up, and then invite everyone to the reception upstairs. Just a few comments, observations based on the discussions this afternoon. One, going back to a question we started with in one of the first panels, what's new? Well, I think it's good to remind ourselves that there are some things that are quite new and distinctive about the SDGs, and particularly the significance of the idea of the universal application of the measures. These are not development goals, they're universal goals, and that actually is it's almost like a final realization of the Brandt Commission or Brundtland Commission ideas back in the 1980s and 90s about our common future. I think that's an important aspect of them. Also, the idea in some work I did a year or so ago, just contrasting the MDGs with the SDGs, it's quite interesting to note that the SDGs explicitly contain a distributional element, concern with equity, concern with employment, issues that were always there in the MDGs, but not in the forefront. It also mainstreams sustainability, so it brings the environment into a global agenda, again, emphasizing ideas of our common future. And then finally, the process was quite different. The MDGs were very much elites, experts, top-down. The SDGs, not a perfect process, but in fact engaged much more of the global public in the creation of the Sustainable Development Goals. That being said, however, sometimes I think we live in a bubble in Geneva, and perhaps we need to remind ourselves, as Gilles did in the panel, that most of the world doesn't actually even know what the SDGs are. There is a very important point, I think, and Michael raised this in his comments toward the end, about the importance of communicating what these are about, and the fact that and I think, as Michael said, the norms need to favor the many. That's in fact a normative statement of quite significance. It's also a very practical statement, because the extent to which people feel excluded from this elitist agenda being discussed in New York and Geneva, in fact, will only give, if there isn't greater engagement, greater communication, we face the risk that the SDGs will be swept to the side by waves of populist anger and rejection of global multilateral, multinational, international engagements altogether. Just to conclude, I've got 3 quick takeaways from this. One, and these are things that I hadn't thought about before, some of these other things I had, is the importance of addressing implementation and monitoring mechanisms. This came up actually from Gilbert, from Stephen, from Nikhil in the early session, and also the point that was also made that we also need to think about countries' capacity. It's not just a matter of will, but it's a matter of capacity, and I thought that was something that I really take away from this. The second is the discussions about norms need to be adjusted, need to be adapted, and in fact, we need to think about the modification of norms, a point that Marie-Paul made and also came up from someone else's points. But this is an ongoing, as I said at the outset, norms have to be performed, constantly practiced, articulated, demonstrated, persuaded, and so on. So we need to think about this as an ongoing practice. And then finally, I think a really interesting point that came up from Susanna's point about deforestation, that it really reminds us of the importance of discourse. That is, how we talk about things can change things. And that's also true with regard, as Mr. Starr pointed out, about migration. If we start thinking, as Cecilia posed the question about changing the discourse about migration into the benefits of migration might be a very important aspect of changing the way we think about these things. But those are just a couple of quick takeaways done on the fly while I'm listening to a very interesting set of sessions. I'd like to conclude by thanking the Dag Hammarskjöld Foundation, Henrik and his staff in particular, for all their assistance in putting this together, and Lisa in particular. I'd like to thank my staff for all of their logistical support, as always, and intellectual support. And I'd also like to thank Michael Mueller for taking the time from his very busy schedule and once again illustrating that leadership does matter. So thank you very much for joining us, Michael. And Bruce, thank you for your introductory paper and comments and contributions throughout the day. So please let me invite you to join us upstairs for a reception in Pedal 1, in the foyer of Pedal 1 by the big sculpture. So immediately following this conclusion. But thank you very much to everyone.